Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto is disowned by his parents in fairy tale. Before I start, please support for more amazing content, and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Dasonone, and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Ignis Deus, Chapter 1. 8 years ago the Kyuubi was released, during Kushina-chan's childbirth. I don't know what happened, or how exactly it happened considering Minato was there by her side at all time, and she never did tell me everything. The shock must have been too much for her. All I learned was that a group called Akatsuki was after the tailed beasts. It's one of the reasons he's here right now, with you. But before I begin with the other reasons, you'd probably want to know what became of Kushina, what made her decide to send him here in your care. It all began 8 years ago, just the day after the assault on Konoha. Is this? An old man asked, peering over in the crib next to the sanding, his eyes scanning the contents of the crib with a critical eye. Next to him stood an elderly woman. She didn't seem to want to get close to the crib. It was like it would devour her at any given moment. Finally, in the background stood a crippled old man holding a cane in his hand, his eye closed in contemplation. Yes, this is him, Sarutobi replied with a sigh. He was tired, he wanted to go and sleep, he wanted to think that everything that had happened yesterday was just a bad nightmare. But even this morning, when he woke up, he knew that it was real and there was no way he could change that, no matter how powerful he was. So what do we do with him? The man peering over the crib asked as the aged Hokage looked down at the ground, thinking. We could train him, replied the old warhawk as he stepped forward into the light. His mother would never agree to it. The woman replied with a scowl on her face as Sarutobi shook his head. I'd never approve of it as well, he replied, looking up at the crippled man and glaring towards him. Minato would be ashamed if I let it happen. Danzo scoffed, and dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Minato is dead. As for the mother, she was the previous host. If you would have let me train her when she was young, none of this would have happened in the first place, he said calmly as he gazed towards the aged Kage. Said Kage narrowed his eyes as he moved forward and brought his hands up to his face. If I would have let you do that, the boy would have never been born. The crippled man scoffed once more. Wouldn't have been a loss, he said, making Sarutobi glare at him. We lost more ninjas than his life is worth, son of a Kage, or not. I agree with Danzo, as a weapon he'd make up for all those lost lives, the woman said as the man took several steps back and shook his head at the statement. The Hokage slammed his fist on the table in front of him and glared towards the elder. I will not turn this child into a toy for you to use as you please, he said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. Think rationally, Sarutobi. Danzo peeked in once more as he took a step forward. The boy has so much potential. He has the blood of both the Namakes and Uzumaki flowing through his veins, he stated as he looked towards the crib with a neutral face. At the same time, he has the Kyuubi sealed inside of him. He's a powerhouse. He can make up for 50 ninja, no, 100 or more if trained right. Sarutobi growled as he looked towards the crib. Danzo was trying to make him go against his promise to the Yondaime. He was trying to make him agree to such an atrocity. Even so, he stated, turning to face the crippled man once more. I will never turn him into a weapon. He will live a normal life, with his mother, and there is nothing you can do about it. He spat out as he stood up and locked eyes with Danzo, daring him to oppose him. The entire room was silent, no one talked and no one moved. The only sounds they could hear were the soft snores of the baby in the crib. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Danzo turned around and started leaving. Fine, play your little game, Sarutobi, but know this, one day, you will regret this decision. I had no idea what he meant by that. The only thing I could think of was an open declaration of war for the boy. I could have had him arrested for treason, but at the same time there was no proof for that. He was slippery just like a snake. We decided to keep his father a secret. No one apart from the elders, myself and a few ANBU knew that he was the son of the late Yondaime. At the same time, I made the worst mistake in my entire life. They constantly pestered me to station an entire division of ANBU at Kushina's door, to always peer over her shoulder on the child, like the boy was a ticking paper bomb. A bomb so powerful that it could wipe the entire village in one blast. But that is not all. I had to choose between that, having her and the boy locked up in one of the abandoned headquarters under constant surveillance, or let the public know the truth of what happened to the Kyuubi. I think you know what I chose in the end. Even that one was horrible. I knew what would happen. I knew what they would do. Even Kushina knew this. She came to me one day and confronted this matter with me. If she wasn't so weakened from the birth and the extraction of the tailed beast, she would have left the village a long time ago. That's what she told me. I would have gladly helped her escape. What happened after that announcement was not what I expected. People rioted, both civilians and ninja alike. They demanded blood, his blood. My ninja did their best in keeping them at bay, but some managed to get through. She fought them off, but she didn't come out unscratched. Her chakra system had been destroyed. It was damaged when the Kyuubi had been extracted, and since then it was repairing itself, but this time, it was gone for good. The doctors gave her only a few years to live, 10 at best. Each time she would use a jutsu or just chakra in general, she would shorten her lifespan. I had to take her off the active ninja duty, and by doing that I forced her on the streets. Due to the fact that we had to keep her marriage a secret, she could not access any of Minato's wealth, not even a penny. I did my best to give her money and support her with what I can, but in the end, all I could do for them is give them an apartment in the Red District where all the drunkards gather up and all the low lives. I'm surprised, however, that no incidents happened. Most of them seemed to have taken a liking into the boy and his mother. Maybe that Uzumaki charm reflected in Naruto as well. I will never know this, however. The fact is that when needed, when the boy was in danger, those so-called low-lives were always there to back him up, to protect him and his mother, and they wanted nothing in return. Sometimes I felt like those so-called low-lives were actually the citizens of Konoha. I am so ashamed of this village, you cannot imagine. But on to the matter at hand. The reason why I sent Naruto to you, the reason is simple. Kushina is dead. She died protecting Naruto. The Uchiha had been planning a coup for some time. We tried to negotiate but everything failed. We then tried to have them exterminated, but surprisingly that failed as well. Kushina arrived at my doorstep, bleeding to death, with her son in her arms. She died begging me to protect him, to save him from this hellhole. I'm writing you this as they are trying to break the door to my office. I can hear my loyal ANBU still fighting outside. But it won't be long before they break down the door and rush in. I will take out as many as I can before they can take me down. But at the same time, I want to fulfill a mother's last request. I've sent you Uzumaki Naruto, to be in your care. I've sent his mother's body with him as well to receive a proper burial in your world. I have no one to send him to. Jiraiya can only do so much. Tsunade is nowhere to be found. There is no one left apart from you. Please do this for me. Do this for a dying old man. Look after the one I consider a grandson. Look after the last person to inherit the will of fire. Signed, Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage. Makarov lowered the letter and looked down at the sobbing child and his deceased mother. She was covered by the Yandame's cape. His eyes then moved to the figure behind the blonde. If he remembered correctly, it was one of the loyal ninjas to the Hokage, one of the ANBU. Said ninja stood like a rock. It was impossible to read him. He didn't move at all. It was like looking at a statue. The man suddenly looked down at the crying boy and kneeled, placing his hand on his head. He then looked up at the guild leader. I'll be leaving him in your care now, he stated in a monotone voice, devoid of any emotion. Where will you go? Makarov inquired. It wasn't like he didn't trust the man, but at the same time he couldn't just let him go and wander around without any information on him. He was an assassin after all. Do not worry, the man said as he looked back down at the boy. I'm returning to my world, to complete Hokage-sama's last order, he declared as the aged guild master's brows shot up in surprise. Order? He asked curiously. The man nodded stiffly, his gaze never leaving the young boy. Finish off those responsible for all this, destroy Konoha, at all costs, he whispered, making Makarov's eyes widen at the declaration. Had the Sandaime lost all hope in Konoha to order something like that? The man suddenly stood up and lowered his mask. He recognized the eyes of the traitors. My name is Uchiha Itachi, last loyal ninja of the Sandaime Hokage, and Konoha's harbinger of death, he declared in a voice so hollow, it reminded Makarov of death itself. Then Naruto the guild master looked towards the boy. It was like he never heard the conversation around him. He was too soaked up in his own shattered world to hear them. No, Itachi replied, shaking his head. He will not return, never, not for revenge, not for assisting me, for nothing. This the young Anbu said, stretching his arms out, motioning to everything around him, to the town, to the world and the guild behind Makarov. This is his world now, this is his home, this is where he will live and where he will die, away from all the hatred, away from all the pain. He lowered his arms and looked down. A small smile appeared on his face, a sad smile. It's what his mother wanted, it's what Lord Hokage wanted, it's what we made him promise, he whispered as his face turned stoic once more and looked up at the old man. Itachi looked at the young boy once more. Naruto, he called out, but there was no reply. Brother, he whispered, but still, the child gave no signs of ever replying back. Itachi knew, however, that the boy was now listening to him. Remember your promise, find friends here, have your own adventure in this land, and don't live your life in hate and never, ever, wish for vengeance. His gaze then turned towards Makarov one last time. I leave him in your care, farewell forever. Hopefully, he said as a portal opened behind him and swallowed him in mere seconds. Ni-san! The young blonde shouted as he felt the pressure of the portal. He turned around, but it was too late. The Uchiha had vanished from this world, returning to the nightmare he had been plucked from. Makarov looked at the boy sadly. Said boy was frozen in shock that the only person he had left as a family was now gone for good. The aged guild master walked over to the boy and placed his hand on his shoulder, gaining his attention. He looked at the boy's eyes and all he could see was pain. He could see the eyes of one that had witnessed all the horrors of mankind. He gave the boy a small reassuring smile. My name's Makarov, guild leader of Fairy Tail. He introduced himself as the boy looked down at the ground and stole a few glances towards his mother's corpse. A few tears started leaking from his eyes. Why don't we give her a funeral? Makarov asked as the blonde gave a weak nod. He smiled slightly at that and moved towards the boy. Using a bit of his Titan magic, he enlarged his body and picked up the deceased mother. She always liked the sunset, the blonde said weakly as Makarov nodded and beckoned the blonde to follow him. The entire night they had spent walking to a nearby hill. They buried her on top of the hill and waited for the sun to rise. The young blonde was impressed by the sight and happy with his mother's final resting place. He could see the large building belonging to the guild in the distance. To him, it was an impressive sight. The walk back to his new home had been made in silence. He didn't know what to talk about and was still in shock over what happened. Makarov did his best to make the young boy get over the death of his mother, but even he knew that it was something one cannot forget in such short amount of time. He opted in trying to cheer him up and explaining this world to the blonde. When Naruto heard about mages, he was immediately sucked in. He wanted to know more, he wanted to learn everything he could about them. For him, it was like living in one of the stories his mother used to read to him. Stories with knights, mages, dragons and all of that. To think that old man Hokage would send him in a world where all of this exists. It made him happy and ever so grateful to the man. As they reached the guild, Naruto stopped and looked around uncertain. Don't worry, he heard Makarov and turned towards him. Everyone in Fairy Tail is family, they will accept you, he said with a smile as the blonde nodded vigorously and followed him inside. Master! Came the cry of two girls who suddenly appeared in front of him. Where have you been? A white-haired girl asked. She was dressed in punk gothic-style clothing, her long hair tied in a ponytail with a violet ribbon. We were worried when we didn't find you this morning. The second girl shouted. She was wearing an armor over her body and her red hair flowed down her back. It reminded Naruto of his mother. He immediately took his eyes from her, as he was reminded by his mother. He felt someone placing their hand on his head and looked towards Makarov, who smiled at him. I'd like to introduce you to our newest member, Naruto Uzumaki, he said with a smile as the girls studied him and grinned. Hey there! The white-haired girl shouted, pushing the redhead away and making her fall on the floor. I'm Mira Jane, she said with a grin as the blonde tried to give a small smile. The girl was suddenly pushed away as the red-haired girl appeared in her place, glaring at Mira Jane. Don't mind Miss Bossy over there, I'm Urza Scarlet, nice to meet you, she exclaimed happily as she extended her hand towards the blonde, who looked away and said nothing. The girl's smile vanished as she lowered her hand. See Urza? You are bad influence. The white-haired girl shouted with a grin as the redhead turned to glare at her. I did nothing wrong, she shouted back as Makarov shook his head and laughed softly. Girls, no one did anything wrong, he said as he looked towards Naruto. Why don't you go and meet the rest? He asked as the blonde gave a weak nod and walked past the girls, not even looking towards them. They exchanged curious glances between each other, and then turned to look at the guild master. His mother died last night to protect him, Makarov said as the two girls looked down in sorrow. But why didn't he greet me? Urza asked, looking back up. Am I really frightening? She asked as Makarov shook his head. It's maybe because of the hair, he said as Urza moved her hand through her hair and looked at it curiously. His mother had red hair as well, must have reminded him of her, he said as the girl's eyes widened. She turned to look around the guild and saw the young blonde talking with Elfman and Lisana. She then looked down sadly and gripped her armor as she remembered her past. She shook her head and made sure to correct this mistake. Makarov smiled as he saw the determination in her eyes. I'll apologize, she said as she turned around and ran over to the blonde, leaving behind a surprised Mira Jane and an amused guild master. Naruto-san? Urza asked as she stopped behind the blonde. The blonde turned to look at her and gave a weak smile as his eyes moved away from her face. I'm sorry if I brought back bad memories, she said with a low voice. Elfman and Lisana looked at her amazed. It was the first time they had heard Urza apologize for something. The blonde gave another weak smile and looked at her this time. You didn't do anything wrong, he said as tears started falling from his eyes, scaring Urza. No, wait, she cried out as she looked towards the guild master for guidance, only to see he had vanished and all that was left was a huffing Mira Jane. She turned back towards the blonde and bit her lower lip as she moved forward and grabbed him in a sluggish embrace to calm him down. The blonde instinctively embraced her, making the girl blush at the act. He cried freely, not even bothering to hide it. His mother always told him there was no shame in crying for the ones you love and care. All activity stopped as the remaining members, which weren't that many to begin with, turned to see the scene before them. They were all quickly informed of the blonde's past, or at least the part that mattered. They gave him solemn looks. After a few minutes the blonde calmed down. He wiped his tears and pulled back, giving a deep bow. I'm sorry for my outburst, he told her as the girl giggled and shook her head. It's okay, feeling better? She asked him, bending forward to look at him. He gave a grin and straightened himself. Yeah, he said cheerfully between a few hiccups. Thank you, Nei-chan, he cried out as the girl brought her hand up to her face and giggled. Mira Jane walked forward and shook her head as she passed the two children. Some boy, you are crying like a girl, she taunted with a smirk as the blonde glared towards her but said nothing else. She giggled at that. She would never admit it, but she found that cute. But it was so much more fun to tease him. She would make it a habit. All right, Makarov shouted as he appeared on the counter. Now that that's all settled, we need to properly welcome Naruto in our little family. A chorus of yes resonated throughout the building. But before that, Makarov said as he beckoned the blonde to approach. You said you wanted to be part of Fairy Tail, right? He asked as the blonde looked around at everyone. He could see them smiling towards him. He looked towards Urza. She was smiling softly towards him, and for a moment he thought he could see his mother standing behind her, smiling at him and encouraging him. Finally, he turned back towards Makarov and nodded vigorously, his eyes filled with determination. Where do you wish to have the symbol? He asked with a smile as the blonde extended his right hand. Moment later he was staring at the guild symbol, on his right hand. He smiled as he looked back up at the guild master. I promise you, Aji-san, I won't let you down, He declared, "I'll become the best mage." "That I do not doubt," boy Makarov replied softly as he saw the blonde run towards the children, already forming bonds with them. 2 years had passed since the blonde joined Fairy Tail. During those years the guild had received 3 more members. All 3 were children roughly his age. The first was a girl named Kana Alberona. The blonde quickly made friends with her. To him, she seemed like a nice girl, although a bit timid. Maybe it was because of the new environment, but he was sure she would get over it sooner or later. The second person to join was a boy named Natsu Drank Neil, a rather hyperactive boy. Needless to say, Naruto and him got along perfectly. Both were hyperactive, both loved to cause trouble or explore the land around them. He was surprised to learn that Natsu had been raised by a dragon, but when he tried to get Natsu to meet this dragon he was turned down. The look in the boy's eyes made the blonde understand something bad had happened, and he didn't press on further. The third, and final, member to join was a boy named Gray. He somewhat reminded Naruto of Sasuke when he first met him, but that thought was soon pushed away. The boy was nothing like that punk from back home. He was a lot more friendly. Sure, he had a few rough edges, but that didn't make him close himself. He was quite friendly and talkative if you got him in the mood. The only downside was that he loved walking around almost completely naked, and worst of all, he was living in the same room as him. That alone wasn't so bad, considering the boy was quiet most of the times, and when Naruto studied or learned how to be a mage the boy would either give him helpful tips or leave him be. No, what was bad about him was that every time he was sent back to his room by Mary Jane to get dressed he would take his clothes, not his own. It was like Gray considered Naruto's clothes to be his very own. Needless to say they got in numerous fights because of that. Natsu joined the fight every time he was around. One thing Naruto never understood was why Natsu loved to get into fights with Gray, or why Gray loved to fight back with Natsu. The only person to actually break them up was Urza. Both boys feared her and her power. Naruto didn't like to admit it, but even he was frightened by Urza. He would never admit this because Urza was a special friend to him. She stayed by his side and helped him a lot to overcome his shock from losing his mother. How she knew that even after he stopped crying back then he was in shock over his loss he will never know, but he was grateful for her help. Then, there was Mary Jane. Naruto couldn't say he hated her. She wasn't a bad person, but she had this bad habit of getting on his, and Natsu's, nerves by either trying to make them cry or laugh at them, and taunt them, when they actually did cry. This of course led to fights between Urza and Mary Jane, fights that could only be broken if either the guild master stopped them or Lee-sana stopped her sister. Mary Jane, or Mira as everyone started calling her, wasn't a bad person. She was quite helpful when she wanted to be. This mostly happened when Urza wasn't around it seemed. It was like she had something against Urza, or she just loved pestering the girl. Towards him, she was quite a pleasant girl. Rarely did she taunt him or make fun of him. It made the blonde wonder what was the trigger that made her do a 180 every time Urza was around. He never did ponder on that too much however. There was no one that Naruto actually didn't like in the entire guild. Despite his rough edges, Makarov's grandson, Luxus, was a great guy. He could be funny at times and when he wanted to and spent quite a lot of time with him, and Natsu especially. He was older than most of his friends in Fairy Tail, about 12 years old or so. He wasn't sure and the boy never told them. Despite all that there were moments when the teen was detached from everyone, when he had a faraway look in his eyes and didn't feel like talking to anyone. They asked him and begged him to tell them what was wrong, but all he would do was smile and tell them everything was fine. Naruto wanted to know why. When he asked Makarov about his grandson's attitude the man had a faraway look in his eyes. He whispered something that Naruto didn't fully understand. Something about his own son. After that however, he never inquired any further. He knew when not to press on. Ever since he had joined the guild he started learning about this world even more. He started training to become a mage as well. Despite the fact that he could not use any spell yet nor did he show any signs of being a mage he continued to try his best to improve in what he already knew. He knew that he could do it. He felt something inside of him. Something that he could use to help him. He knew that the world he came of was filled with ninja and what they used was called chakra. But he didn't know how to use that, nor how to call upon it. His mother didn't want to ruin his childhood and teach him ninja techniques not yet. The only thing she did teach him was stealth and how to blend in with others. Even after he arrived in this world he never stopped practicing what his mother taught him. He could vanish from everyone's eyes and no one would realize it until he was far away from their reach. Despite being told not to do this too often, he had used his ability in stealth to play pranks on the nearby town. No one had caught him and no one had seen him. It eased Makarov a little bit but he was still not pleased with how the blonde was using his abilities. He made sure to voice his opinion and berate the blonde, making him promise not to pull pranks on the townspeople anymore. After all jobs started appearing with a bounty on his head, he couldn't have the council figure out that one of the members of Fairy Tail was pulling pranks on people. While he was forbidden to ever pull stunts like that the blonde still used all his knowledge in becoming a master in stealth. There were only a handful of people in the guild that could find him during his vanishing acts, Makarov being one of them of course. Currently the blonde was outside in the gardens, practicing his magic, or at least trying to create something. Next to him stood Makarov. He was looking at the blonde, waiting patiently for him to do something. Naruto remembered the man's words. He concentrated, he studied, he stayed away from the dark arts and focused on only that which was permitted. And yet, he still couldn't do anything. Everyone in the guild had some sort of power, even the youngest of them could do something. Heck, Natsu was stronger than him on all accounts. With a sigh, Makarov stood up and shook his head. Naruto, maybe fire is not your affinity. No! The blonde shouted as he slammed his fist on the ground, glaring down. Hokage Aji-san said I have the will of fire. That doesn't mean that you can control fire. It's not even related to that to begin with. Makarov tried to reason, but it didn't work. Once the blonde set his mind on something, nothing, but absolutely nothing could change his mind. He was scared that one day it will lead him to his own grave. But the blonde started looking sadly at the ground. "I'm from Hai no Kuni, we all have fire affinity," he whispered. In his mind, if he was born in fire country it meant that he would have affinity for fire. Makarov only shook his head at that. "Your father never used fire. He couldn't control it nor summon it. Your mother was able to control a bit, and use jutsus, but that was mostly because of the Kyuubi," he said. Naruto twitched as he heard the name. He still didn't know what to make of the fox. Part of him wanted to hate him for everything that had happened, from his father's death to his mother's death. But part of him felt like he couldn't blame the fox and that the blame fell on the man that assaulted his mother when he was born and the villagers for their blind hatred. He didn't make contact with the fox. The idea of going there and trying to talk with the fox just scared him. He also never told anyone in the guild about this. Only Makarov knew what he held inside of him. Even though people asked him about the whiskers and why he had them, he always replied them with what his mother said. "It's a trait from Mom, just shows I'm her son." When asked about his mother and if she was human or not, he said nothing. Makarov cleared things up and told them she was human, but they still wanted to learn more about the whiskers. Therefore, the only thing Makarov could think of was that the whiskers were a hereditary family trait, which rarely appears. Strangely, they seemed to accept that and never inquired further. "Maybe you are a different type of mage, a wind mage or ice." "No!" Naruto shouted once again, startling Makarov. "I'll be a fire mage. Just wait and see, old man, I'll do it. I'll become the greatest fire mage in history. I will make Ka-san, Tu-san and Nii-san proud," he declared as he stood up and walked away, leaving a smiling guild master behind. The man shook his head at the blonde. "Don't come crying to me when you realize it's impossible then," he called out, yet the blonde ignored him. He laughed to himself as he walked back to the guild. This was going to be interesting. Chatter and laughter echoed in the guild as everyone was sitting at the tables and eating. Only one person was missing for the 9th time in a row, and that person was none other than Naruto. Everyone was worried. The only ones that didn't seem to be worried were Makarov and his grandson. They both had faith in the blonde. It had been a week since the blonde's declaration. At first nothing changed with him. He kept coming in morning to eat, and then at night, or in the middle of the day if he was famished. But ever since 3 days ago the blonde had stopped coming down from his room to eat. Mira was the first to confront the blonde. She tried to force him to move, she tried taunting him, but it was like her voice hit a stone wall. The blonde didn't flinch, or even acknowledge her presence. In a fit of anger she ordered Urza to move the blonde from his spot, which resulted in a fight between them. A fight that was later broken by the guild master. That night, however, he left them without berating them like he would usually do. He was strangely quiet. The next morning Gray tried to move the blonde. He tried encasing him in ice and pushing him downstairs, however. It seemed like Naruto had anticipated that and vanished before Gray could even make a move. It annoyed him to no end, and it also worried him. Urza found him eventually in the garden, hidden in his usual spot under the large plants that Makarov loved to grow. She tried talking to him, tempting him with his favorite food, but nothing seemed to work. His gaze was constantly fixed on a book for apprentice magicians. He kept studying that book over and over again like he had missed something. "Naruto," Urza said softly, "if you want I could teach you my style," she said as the blonde didn't even turn towards her. "No," he said quietly, "that's your style. I want mine." "I know I can do this," he replied stubbornly. "But Naruto, at least come and eat." She tried to reason with him, yet the blonde had tuned her out by now. She tried for several more minutes to get through him before she turned and left, telling the blonde not to come crawling towards her if he was dying of hunger. Yet, as she reached the door she turned to look back towards the blonde's location. She was worried for him. That night Mira tried her luck once again. She stormed towards his room and slowly opened the door. "Ka-san," she heard him. She slowly peered inside and looked around the room. The blonde was sitting in the middle of the room with books and papers scattered all around him. He was looking at something in his hands. "I can't do it," she could hear his voice crack and looked down at the ground sadly. "I don't know why, Ka-san, please help me," he begged. Slowly, Mira closed the door and took a deep breath. She knocked and then opened the door. She was surprised to see the blonde reading through the books and his notes, like nothing had happened until now. "Naruto," she said softly. She had a weak spot for him. She never admitted it, but he was cute and a dependable person. She liked that he had a soft spot and wasn't only muscle and no brains. The blonde gave no reply, however. It didn't even seem like he was acknowledging her presence. Slowly, she walked over to him and sat down behind him. She moved forward and wrapped her arms around him, making him tense. He was forced to hold a surprised gasp from escaping his lips. Mira placed her head on his back and looked at the wall to the right. I'm sure you can do it, she told him, making the boy's eyes widen and making him wonder if she had heard him call out for his mother. I'm sure you will be able to become a mage. They stood in silence for what seemed like hours. The blonde didn't know what to tell her. Then she suddenly stood up and walked out of the room without saying any other word. It surprised him that she didn't snap at him. She was very strict, this he had never expected in the first place. With a smile he turned back to work, bent on finishing what he started. There was no way Naruto Uzumaki would be defeated, not now, not ever. After 4 days of absence, the blonde finally made his appearance. Everyone was gathered at the tables, preparing to have their meal when they heard the blonde. Chi-san! They could hear him yell and running down the stairs towards them. Makarov looked towards the stairs and saw the blonde there with a large grin on his face. His entire face was however red and black, like he had burned himself. Part of his clothes were also ripped, exposing his chest, which was also red. Naruto? Makarov asked in a worried voice. What happened? He asked, trying to move towards the blonde. I did it! He shouted, pumping his fists in the air. Everyone jumped up from their seats and moved to help the blonde, to check on him, only to have him stop them. Look! He shouted as he extended his right arm and opened his palm, turning it to face the ceiling. A large flame then shot out of his palm, or so it seemed. It was twice as big as the blonde, yet it didn't seem like he was affected by it. You actually did it? Makarov asked. He never expected the blonde to create something this big. He knew that in the end the blonde could succeed, but this was beyond all his expectations. Yeah! Shouted the blonde, and look what else I can do. The flame then shot upward and descended towards the blonde, scaring everyone for a second. Yet before the flame could harm the blonde, it moved to the side and started swirling around him, like it was a shield meant to protect him. And look at this! He said once more as the flame moved in front of him and started taking shape. It's happy, he declared with a grin. Indeed, the flame had taken the cat's form, even going as far as doing its trademark pose. The cat did the same pose with a resonating eye. The flame then started taking another shape. In mere seconds they were staring at a copy of Makarov. It wasn't perfect, but it looked almost like him. And this, the blonde's voice resonated once more as the flame started morphing once more. Now instead of Makarov, the flame had taken the form of a woman they had never seen in their life. They could vaguely distinguish her features as the model wasn't perfect from what it seemed. Kushina? The guild master asked, completely amazed. Yes, the blonde replied with a small smile. This is Ka-san. Everyone's eyes grew at that. The blonde had created, or at least tried to, create an image of his mother. This was something unheard of, and something a low-ranking mage could barely do. Yet the blonde didn't even seem winded by all this. Finally, the guild master started laughing. That's mighty impressive, boy! He shouted with a grin on his face that was matched by said boy. Now why don't you come and eat? I'm sure you're famished. He said as the blonde nodded happily. However, what they didn't expect was for the fire to explode in front of the blonde. Urza and Mira shouted for the blonde and rushed towards him as Makarov and the rest looked at what happened in shock. A cough was heard as the smoke cleared, revealing a redder Naruto. I need, he coughed, to work on dispelling the fire without it exploding in my face. He stated as 2 pairs of hands suddenly grabbed him and started shaking him. Don't you ever do that again. He heard both Urza and Mira shout at him. The girls turned to glare at each other before glaring at the blonde, who smiled sheepishly. Sorry, I promise I won't do it again. He said as they entangled him in a hug. Everything had returned to normal, or as normal as it can get in the guild. Ignis Deus, Chapter 2. Naruto ran happily through the town of Magnolia. He had finally managed to complete a low-ranking mission that the guild master let him do. It was an easy job that didn't involve any fighting, but it paid the blonde enough money to go through town, and buy something that catches his eyes. The 10-year-old boy ran from store to store browsing all their articles. He looked at magical objects and clothes as well. Ever since he saw those powerful mages and how they dressed, he wanted to find some kind of clothing that would make him stand out, and at the same time recognized and respected, or feared by his enemies. Yet, all the articles he could find were over-exaggerated in price. He had only a quarter of what he needed. It would require to take on even more jobs before he could buy the clothes he wanted. With a sigh, he left the store and kept walking down the trade district. He stopped as his eyes landed on the most prestigious store in the district. From what he heard, the most prestigious in all of Fiori. They had everything a mage needed. With a large grin, he ran towards the store and pushed the doors open, stepping inside. He was amazed at how massive the place was. He felt incredibly small in here. Looking around, he saw mages browsing through the store, looking at all kinds of items. Potions, books, weapons, mediums, there was everything here. Excuse me, boy. The blonde turned around and saw a large man carrying several scrolls under his arm. This is a store for mages. Unless you are a mage and part of a guild, I'd have to ask you to leave, he stated. Children normally joined guilds from a young age. It wasn't a rule, but it was easier for them to get to know everyone and to gauge everyone's skill. It helped them find partners and increase their overall potential as a mage. With a grin, the boy showed the man his tattooed hand and presented him with a copy of the official papers. Makarov told him to never leave without them. It was a rule imposed by the council that mages had to have a copy of their forms when entering stores to identify them. That little fact would later change, however. The man looked at the emblem and nodded, recognizing it. He then read through the papers and a smile appeared on his serious face. Everything is in order. Welcome to Armafor, young man. If there's anything you need, feel free to tell me," he said with a warm smile as the blonde bowed and nodded vigorously. "I will, thank you, sir," he exclaimed as the man smiled one more time before he walked away to continue his work. The young boy turned to look around once more, and held his breath as a large smile appeared on his face. He never believed he would be here to begin with. He didn't know where to start from. He shook his head. He would have to look at everything related to fire mages or just fire in general. That would narrow down his search and help him find something of use. For the next several hours the blonde had spent his time in the store, browsing through everything they had related to fire or fire mages in general. A few of the mages were kind enough to help him around and tell him where to look for certain items. It felt so much different here than back in the land he was born. He detested thinking about it, but he loved comparing the two. It just showed how better life was here, unbound from their laws and their glares. For the first time, the blonde was sad not because he couldn't buy something, but because he didn't actually have enough money to afford it. No one tried to scam him or change the prices. Everything was fair trade. He saw several weapons that would enhance his fire spells. He even saw a gauntlet said to have been forged by the king of dragons himself, though that was more of an item for a dragon slayer, and not for him. There was also a scythe on display. At first the blonde was scared it might be related to the dark arts. The store owner clarified his confusion. Apparently the scythe wasn't a weapon of the dark arts. The scythe had its own powers. It was able to create illusions and flames from nothing. He studied it with fascination. He had never heard of such a weapon, but at the same time he rarely spent time reading all those magazines like Urza and Mira do. He focused on his training day in and day out. He wanted to perfect everything. At times they told him he was isolating himself too much, so he did his best to correct that by hanging with his friends more and dividing his schedule so that he could spend time with the ones important in his life and keep studying and improving. He finally moved his gaze away from the scythe and returned to the book section. He studied every little book with fascination. There were books that could teach him how to create potions, elixirs, and then there were books like he had back in his room, meant to teach him the basics, to improve, and for the experts, books on how to create their own unique spells and styles of fighting. His eyes finally rested on a large red book entitled The Art of Fire Elementals. His brows shot up in surprise. He had heard of those beings and was fascinated by them. He looked at the price and his eyes gleamed happily as he saw he had enough money to purchase it. Quickly grabbing it, he ran to the counter where the shopkeeper was sitting and reading through the scrolls. He looked up from the scrolls at the young blonde who handed him the book. The man looked over the book and then back at the blonde child with surprise in his eyes. "You know this is a book for advanced mages, right?" he asked as the blonde nodded with a big smile. "I know, but I don't care. Someday it will help me." "Better have it now than never," he said with a grin as the man smiled and nodded. After paying for the item he bid farewell to the shopkeeper and left the shop. His mind was completely focused on the book. He already wanted to go home and read it. Sure, it might be a while until he could actually practice spells for summoning elementals or spells used by said elementals, but it was worth looking through it. "There you are!" he heard someone exclaim. He looked up surprised and then grinned happily as his eyes rested on the red-haired girl. "Urza-chan!" he shouted, running towards her. Said girl blushed slightly and glared at him. "What did I tell you about calling me that?" she asked with a small huff as the blonde grinned sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. "Never to call you that, but still, Urza, you're cute when you blush." The girl's blush deepened as she heard that and stammered a few words before turning around with her back at him. The blonde laughed at her antics, making the girl silently fume. There were a few girls in Fairy Tail that had a small crush on him. Urza and Mary Jane were a prime example, where other girls had started to get over their crush. For these two it didn't seem to go away. Their fights now mostly started because of said blonde. Each one wanted his attention to be on them and them alone. The blonde was oblivious to all of this. He thought they were just having fun and playing around. He didn't even know the girls had a crush on him. "Laugh it up, I will have my revenge," she said with an evil grin as the blonde's sweat dropped and laughed nervously. "Did you buy anything, Urza?" he asked as the girl shook her head. They started walking back towards the guild. "There was nothing that caught my eye," she said with a frown. "I see you bought something," she stated, eyeing the book in the blonde's arms. The blonde looked down at the book and then at the girl with a smile. "Yeah, it's a really cool book that will allow me to summon fire elementals and learn more spells," he chimed happily as the girl gave him a soft smile. "I'm glad you found something like that," she said. They walked in silence for a few minutes, enjoying each other's company. Urza was nervous. It had been some time since she opened up to the blonde and most of the guild. While she still couldn't let go of the past, she hoped that one day she would be able to accept it. With Naruto it was different. She feared what would happen if he turned on her like it happened in the past with her friend. "Urza?" She heard the blonde speak and turned to face him. "Why do you always wear that armor?" he asked as the girl looked away from him. "I feel safe," she replied without beating a sweat. "But it must feel uncomfortable," he said as the girl glared towards him and then looked away. "It's just who I am. I feel safe this way. Just leave it like that," she shouted as she felt the blonde stop walking. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized that she had snapped at the blonde. She turned towards him thinking he would be mad. However, he had a look of understanding in his eyes. "Urza-chan," he said, moving towards her. The girl didn't try to berate him this time for using chan at the end of her name. Whatever happened, Whatever will happen, I will always be there for you," he said with a smile as her heart skipped a beat. "I will never let anyone hurt you. I'd die before anyone hurt you," he declared. The girl, however, was reminded by her past and looked down at the ground sadly. She then felt the blonde embrace her. Her eyes widened at the contact but said nothing. "Trust me, Urza-chan, as long as I draw breath, no one will hurt you, or anyone from Fairy Tail. I don't want my past to repeat itself. I'll give it all to protect everyone," he declared, holding her tightly in his embrace. Urza was speechless. She didn't know what to say. A small smile appeared on her lips as she punched him lightly in the chest, making him take a step back. "I told you not to call me that," she said with a smile on her face. The blonde could see a tear drop from her left eye. He smiled towards her and nodded once. "Let's go back. I'm sure Master is worried by now," she said, laughing softly as the blonde moved next to her. She looked towards the blonde. He was something, that was for sure. It seemed like when people were around him, all their worries just vanished away. She couldn't place it. Not even Mira knew what it was that made him so special. Makarov said it was a family trait, but he didn't expand on it. The happy gleam in his eyes, however, told them everything they needed to know. Though she would never admit it, with him, she felt safe. While she was indeed stronger than him in terms of power, his heart was stronger than hers, and she relied on him more than anything in the world. Urza looked down at the ground, clutching her chest, the smile never leaving her face as she thought about the blonde. Maybe it wasn't just a crush, she was still too young to know, but she felt different when near the blonde. The walk back to the guild was made in silence, but not an awkward one. It was a pleasant silence. All the time while walking back to their home, Urza tried to get closer to him, until they were walking shoulder by shoulder. The blonde didn't seem to mind as he only gave her a radiant smile. It made her happy to see those smiles. Her good mood came to a halt, however, as they reached the entrance of the guild. Outside stood Mira Jane, and from the looks of it she was angry. Angry was an understanding. It seemed like she was about to break something. Naruto wasn't sure, but he somehow felt like this was going to be his fault, whatever was going to happen. Urza glared at her rival as she stepped in front of the blonde and walked over to Mira. She glared at her before walking past her. "I had fun," she taunted as the white-haired girl's face reddened. She could hear Urza laugh victoriously as she vanished behind the guild's door. "Mira? Are you sick?" the blonde asked as a hand was placed on her forehead. Her eyes widened as she slapped the hand away and stammered. "I'm fine, don't worry," she exclaimed as the blonde blinked owlishly before grinning. "All right, if you say so," he said as he ran past her. "Wait, where are you going?" Mira called as she turned towards the blonde. "To my room. I want to read this book," he shouted happily as he vanished behind the doors. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she shook her head. If only she had been faster, she could have spent the day with him. A dark aura appeared around her as she remembered the reason why she couldn't spend the day with him. She had been tricked by Urza, and the redhead had dared to taunt her a few moments ago. She began plotting her revenge. She would make sure Urza would never trick her like that. With an evil laugh, she walked back inside the guild, scaring Natsu, who was returning from a walk in the forest. He stood outside, frozen in shock and fear for a few moments before carefully walking back inside the guild. As Naruto entered his and Gray's room, he slammed the doors shut and hugged the book to his chest. "Ack!" He heard a yell followed by several crashes. He looked towards the origin of the sounds and started laughing as he saw a glaring Gray under a ton of books. "How many times do I have to tell you not to place your entire book collection in one pile next to my bed?" he asked with a glare that Naruto thought it would actually burn him. "You've never complained about my stuff before," Naruto said with a deadpan look as Gray's sweat dropped. "I'm not complaining. When do I complain?" the boy retorted in shock. Naruto looked incredulously at him. "What do you call this?" he inquired, making a reference to what he said a few moments ago. "Besides, I never complained when you took my clothes." He glared at the boy, who laughed nervously. "We have a barter system?" he asked nervously as the blonde rolled his eyes. But even so, Gray continued with a glare as he looked towards the pile of book on top of him. "Sorry about that," he said, scratching his head as he walked over to his bed and placed his newly purchased book on it. He then walked towards Gray and started moving all the books away, helping the boy out of them. As the last book was moved from the boy's body, it made Naruto wonder why Gray didn't just stand up when the weight wasn't that much anymore. He extended his hand to the boy and helped him back on his feet. With a nod, Gray plopped back on the bed and turned with his back towards the blonde, making said blonde's sweat drop at that. If Gray wasn't picking fights with Natsu, trying to get a higher ranking job, or trying to steal someone's clothes, he would sleep and sleep to no end. With a sigh, Naruto walked back to his bed and plopped down, but before he could relax, he heard Gray talking. "I hope you're cleaning your mess. Last I need is tripping on your stuff and breaking something." Naruto's eyebrows twitched at the comment. Who would be dumb enough to trip on some book or scrolls and break something? Still, he couldn't afford to get into serious fights with Gray. The boy was still stronger than him on all accounts. With a sigh, he proceeded to clean up the mess. Gray hadn't changed at all since he first met him, either did Natsu. It made the blonde happy. He hoped that they would stay the same forever and never break the bonds they created. He cherished his friends more than anything. In the end, it was the only thing he had in this world, his only treasure. A sad smile appeared on his face as he looked towards the calendar. His mother's birthday was just 1 month away. He made a habit of visiting her grave monthly. There was nothing wrong in that. What was wrong was the fact that he kept playing with the flames, modeling them so much until he could actually create his mother's image. It became like an addiction for the blonde. Makarov tried to stop him from continuing his work. He told him it would only make him suffer more. The blonde didn't understand what the old man was saying. He was happy every time his mother appeared before him, even though it wasn't the real deal. Naruto Gray whispered, drawing the blonde out of his train of thoughts. I'm worried, he said while looking towards him. The blonde looked down at the ground knowing Gray was talking about him. Don't worry, I'm fine. He reassured him with a large smile. As the boy studied him for a second, he nodded and turned around, going back to sleep. Though he wasn't pleased with the answer, Naruto turned to look at the book sadly. He picked it up and opened it, starting to read its contents. Sometimes he felt like they just couldn't understand him and his pain. Sometimes he felt like they wanted to hold the only shimmer of happiness he had from her away. Mary Jane sighed for the umpteenth time from what it seemed today. Just a day had passed since the Naruto returned from his mother's grave. On her birthday he had the habit of leaving early in the morning and staying at her grave all day, only to return the next day. It never bothered them that much, at least not before he showed his ability to control fire so freely. The 10-year-old blonde was acting strangely. All the time when he would return from his mother's grave he would summon the fire and shape it into her form. He would spend the days locked in his room, not opening the door to anyone, not even his roommate. At times she spied on him and saw him interacting with the flame. It was a sad display in her mind. The blonde was still suffering, yet he didn't want to show it to anyone. He was bottling up all his emotions inside of him. It pained Mary Jane to see him like that. She wanted to help him, but there was nothing she could do. He didn't want to listen to anyone. When he didn't listen to Makarov himself, it said something. It said just how much the blonde had shut himself from the world around him. He was locked inside his own fantasy world, inside his own fairy tale, in the world he had lost. At times like this she didn't have the strength to fight against Urza. The same went for the girl in question. In times like this they usually teamed up to try and get through to the blonde. But it was like that time when he was learning to summon the fire, when he was aiming to actually become a mage. She felt angry towards him. Part of her said it was wrong to be angry at him. It wasn't his fault. The only thing he held dear was ripped apart from him like that. Yet another part told her that he should let it go, that while he should never forget the past he shouldn't constantly live in it. She was afraid that one day she might snap at him and the repercussions would be too harsh. For that, she tried to avoid him when she felt the anger inside of her trying to break out. She tried to steer clear of him when she felt the urge to shout at him and berate him for what he was doing. It wasn't her place to dictate his way of life, but she was worried for him. She didn't want to lose him, and she didn't want for him to lose his sanity. That day she just couldn't stand it anymore. She sneaked through the hallways and carefully lockpicked the door to the blonde's room. She peered inside, and the sight she saw shocked her to no end. The boy had tucked himself in bed. That alone wasn't strange. By the bedside, however, was the flame. It was shaped perfectly after his mother. You would believe it was an actual human. The only dead giveaway was the fact that she was completely red and a few bits of flames would rise up and dissipate in the air. His eyes, however, they were dead for the lack of better words. She could not see the blonde inside those eyes. It was like he was lost in the past. Another story, Ka-san, please, he whispered with a smile. Yet his eyes remained dull. There was no light in them. Mira gripped her chest as she felt tears dripping from her eyes. She lowered her head and silently closed the door. As the door closed, she took a few steps back and clenched her fist. She wondered how it came to this. How could they not see what was happening to him? The scar never actually healed. It only intensified. And now, thinking back at the events that lead the blonde to succeed in becoming a fire mage, she couldn't help but blame herself for everything. With a determined look in her eyes, she walked away, heading towards the bar to find the guild master. She would have to talk to him and make him understand that he had to put an end to what was happening to the blonde, lest they would lose him. However, she was surprised, shocked and angered when Makarov said that it wasn't his place to get involved. She was angry when he told her to leave it be, that it would work itself out. She couldn't believe that. She saw him. She saw the look in his eyes. If he carried on like that, there would be no turning back. Then it happened. At first it was Urza that snapped at the blonde. She berated him for closing himself up from everyone. Urza was always strict, yet at the same time, she cared deeply for him. His apology never reached her. As she left before he could even utter a word, he knew he had screwed up. He only hoped that it wouldn't be too late. A month before his birthday was Mirajane's turn to snap. The blonde was slowly coming back out of his shell and returning to his old self. Yet all that anger and frustration bottled up inside the white-haired girl finally made its way out. She would never forget the hurt look on his face, though she forgot the words she had uttered to the blonde on that day, as her mind wanted her to forget forever. His expression was forever burned into her mind. For weeks she could not show her face to him. She thought she had screwed up for good. It was him that in the end brought her out of that guilt. It was him that told her he was alright and he apologized for his own actions. While that made her happy, deep inside she was still hurt for what she had said. She would never be able to forgive herself. The 11-year-old blonde scratched his chin as he looked at the cards in his hands. His eyes moved to the girl in front of him. Kana had a grin on her face as she inspected her card. He cursed under his breath. As much as he hated playing cards with the girl, he just couldn't refuse her when she invited him for a game. She enjoyed humiliating her opponents at any card game, but it seemed like she enjoyed humiliating him even more. He dismissed that thought, however. There was no way she would actually enjoy that. They were friends. So, Naruto, she said, leaning forward on the table, placing her hands under her chin and her grin never leaving her face. Want to raise the bet? She asked as the blonde looked over his cards and started sweating. Part of him wanted to raise the bet. It was easy money, it told him, but the other part reminded him of all those times he had lost money to Kana. Out of all the young members of Fairy Tail, Naruto was among the top ones, with the most money and number of missions completed under his belt. The only ones topping him were Urza and Mira herself. He smirked, however. There was no way he would regret this. I say 3,000 more jewels, the blonde declared as the onlookers cheered for the blonde and encouraged him. Mira shook her head with a heavy sigh. The blonde just signed his own death warrant, so to speak. Fine, Kana replied with a smirk, as she placed 3,000 more on the table, on top of the already existing 7,000 jewels. Show me your hand, the blonde said as he showed his 2 aces and 2 queens. Kana looked at the cards and smiled evilly. His eyes widened in horror as she placed the cards down, showing a royal flush, while the blonde said, jumping from his seat and looking at the cards with wide eyes. But he stammered, his eyes wide in shock. He couldn't understand what just happened. I'll take this, thank you very much, Kana said, grabbing the money on the table and pocketing it. Maybe next time, Naruto, she said with a wink as the blonde started slamming his head on the table and making the girl laugh at him and his misfortune. What kind of friend laughs at their friend's misfortune? Demanded Naruto as he pointed towards Kana accusingly. One that walked home with said friend's money, she replied with a grin, making the blonde slump down on the chair. I told you not to bet against Kana-chan, Mira said as she stepped forward and stopped behind the blonde. Said blonde grumbled under his breath as the girl's eyebrows twitched. She placed her hands on his shoulder, making him tense and shiver uncontrollably. What was that, Naruto-kun? She asked sweetly as the blonde turned towards her, laughing nervously. Nothing, Mira-chan, absolutely nothing, he said between nervous laughs. As much as I love seeing you beat your boyfriend, I still have a game to play with him, Kana said with a smirk as a deep blush appeared on both Mira's and Naruto's cheeks. He's not my boyfriend, the goth girl growled as she flung the blonde from his chair and into the air. Said blonde had a deadpan look on his face as he was flying through the air. Realizing what she had done, she turned towards the blonde with a frightened look on her face. Naruto, she exclaimed as he crashed in the bar. Moments later, Urza walked behind the bar and picked the blonde up. Dusting him, she turned towards Mira and glared. The girl returned the glare in full force. Well, little demon girl shows her true colors? She asked with a sinister look on her face. Naruto gulped, knowing where this would lead. He couldn't understand why they always starting fighting because of him. It was a mystery he just couldn't solve, and Makarov didn't help at all. What did you say, tomato? Mira shot back as Urza laughed at the poor attempt at insulting her. You heard me. I think it's best if Naruto stays away from you, least he will get seriously hurt from your mood swings, she replied with her grin ever present on her face. The blonde thought he could see sparks flying between the two. He knew now that there was only a moment left before they started fighting. Carefully, he slipped away and moved as far away as he could from the two girls. He was lucky they usually ignored him when they started fighting, else he feared what they would do to him if they found him sneaking away. As he tried to walk out of bar, he bumped into Natsu that was just retuning from a job. He looked up at his friend. Get me out of here, he whispered as the boy looked in the bar, wondering what frightened the blonde. His eyes widened in fear as he felt the tense atmosphere and saw the two girls glaring at each other. With a swift move, he grabbed the blonde by the collar and ran out of the bar. There was no way he would go inside just as the two would start fighting. He knew better than to get in between their fight. Both boys stopped in the middle of the town, panting and sweating. Slowly, they both started laughing, their laughter filling the night. Oi! Shut up! Someone yelled as a shoe was flung towards them. The boys dodged it and ran away from the area while still laughing. It was moments like these that made the blonde happy, spending time with his friends and having fun with them. He wished these moments would last forever. Even though they would soon come to the age when they would take on even more dangerous missions, he hoped that they would all prevail over all the obstacles. The two kept running down the empty streets, at one point running past the night patrol that looked at them curiously before resuming his patrol. Mostly everyone in town knew Natsu and Naruto. They were known for their talent as mages and their quirks. They came at a halt at one of the bridges. They stood on its edge, throwing pebbles into the calm river. So what happened this time? Natsu asked, trying to strike up a conversation with the blonde. Said blonde sighed before beginning his short tale. I played a game of cards with Kana, again lost, obviously, and then Mira-chan came and berated me. Nothing out of the ordinary. Natsu laughed as the blonde snorted. Yeah, but then it was that Kana told Mira to leave, and I quote, your boyfriend, he replied, taking a pause or something like that. He whispered, all I remember is being flung in the air and crashing in the bar, Urza-chan coming and starting a fight again. Natsu's laughter filled the air as the blonde finished the tale. There was never a dull day in the guild with them around. Naruto only shook his head at his friend. The boy wasn't helping at all. Where is Happy though? He asked as Natsu immediately answered. Spending the day with Lisana. Oh. Naruto replied as he threw another pebble in the river. I heard Gray talk, Natsu said after a short pause, making the blonde turn and look at him curiously. He wondered what Gray had said. The boy usually kept to himself unless there was something actually important to say. Then there was the time when he said whatever came to his mind to get into fight with Natsu. That lone sentence meant something else. Usually if Natsu got in a fight with Gray he would just rant on and on how Gray was being a bastard. "You're at it again," Natsu said, looking down at the river. The blonde looked away from his friend and at the river as well. He knew what he meant, but there was no helping it. As much as he wanted to stop, he just couldn't put an end to recreating his mother's image and imagining, that he was living in the past once more. "I think you should stop," the Dragon Slayer continued. "I'm afraid of what might happen if this continues," he told the blonde as he turned around and started walking back to the guild, leaving Naruto alone to think. "I'm afraid as well." Naruto replied to no one. A week had passed since the fight in the bar and Naruto's little talk with Natsu. Currently the blonde boy was in the guild's garden, practicing his fire spells. He was slowly improving. Even Makarov was impressed by the blonde and his ability to shape fire at his own will. "You have a great talent there, boy, don't let it go to waste," is what he said, and Naruto took it to heart. Ever since he first managed to summon the fire he felt a connection to it. It felt easy to control it. He could just think of its existence, and it would appear. He could just wish for it to vanish, and it would. He didn't need to chant, he didn't need to call upon it. All he needed to do is think it exists. All he needed to do is desire for it to move, change shapes or obey him. It did everything he wanted, but for him it just wasn't enough. He believed that if he worked with spells and learned a handful of them, or even more, he could do so much more. He was happy to know that his friends supported him on his little quest, or as he liked to call it, experiment. In truth, it was an experiment. He wanted to know if he could control spells like he controls the fire. He wanted to know if he could bend the spell to his own will and make so that he would just wish for it to happen and it would. In theory it proved easy, however, in practice it was at a whole different level. The blonde couldn't understand it. It was easy to control and manipulate fire, but spells seemed to be at a whole different level. Makarov tried to reassure the blonde that everything takes time. He knew that himself. There was nothing that could be earned by doing absolutely nothing. You had to work for everything that you desired, but it still felt like it was taking too much time to actually complete something. It was stressful, to say at least. He was shaken out of his thoughts as he heard someone approach. He looked behind him and saw Urza sitting there with a stoic look on her face. Most likely she had gotten in a fight with Mirjane once again and lost, this time. "What's wrong, Urza?" he asked with a small smile as the girl sat next to him, and huffed. "Nothing," she mumbled as the blonde looked at her incredulously. Over the years he had gotten to know her very well. He knew when she was lying and he knew that she was always hurting inside. No matter how hard he tried to break the shell around her and find out what was hurting her so much, he never had any success in that matter. At times it felt really hopeless. But he wouldn't give up on that. He would find out what hurts her and make it go away. After all, what were friends for? "That doesn't sound very convincing," he said as he looked down at his scrolls and started rolling them up. The girl stood silent for a couple more minutes before talking. "It's Gray," she said with a low voice. "Gray?" he asked before his face scrunched into an angry look. "That bastard, I'll kick his ass if he hurt you," he declared as he stood up and prepared to leave to find said boy. He stopped, however, as he felt her grab his shirt. Naruto looked down at her. She had her hand extended towards him, holding his shirt tightly in her fist. Yet she was still looking down at the ground. "He did nothing wrong, he is right," she said with a low voice as the blonde turned towards her. Her grip on his lessened until it completely faded. "But," she said as she turned to look at him, "I'm afraid," she whispered, a few tears dripping from her left eye. Naruto dropped his scrolls and kneeled down next to his friend. He gently embraced her and listened to her sniffing and trying to hold back her cry. "What's hurting you?" he asked. "I know something's hurting you, can't you tell me?" he asked. Her grip on his tightened as she shook her head furiously. The blonde frowned sadly at that. He pulled away from her and looked at her in the eyes. A smile appeared on his face. "Then I promise you this," he said as Urza looked up at him. Whenever he made a promise, he kept it. Everyone knew that. "When I grow up, I'll be with you," he told her with a large grin as her eyes widened and a small blush appeared on her cheeks. "What do you mean?" she asked curiously. His brows furrowed before they relaxed, and a smile adorned his face. "That way, I will always protect, I can always make you happy, and I will make all the things that hurt you go away," he told her with a large smile as she processed what the blonde told her. She started sniffing again, and grabbed him in an embrace, crying in his chest as the blonde gently stroked her back, trying to calm her down. They never noticed a pair of eyes looking at them in sadness. Ignis Deus, Chapter 3. There were only 6 months left until his birthday, and things weren't too bright. To say that he had upset Mirjane and Urza was too little said. They were downright furious with him. He had taken his obsession to a whole new level, having the fire walk with him most of the time. His mother's birthday had been a month ago, and ever since then, not only did he lock himself in his room, but when he did come out, he came out with the flame in tow. No matter what people said, he wouldn't dispel it. For most it was unnerving, for a few it was downright scary. Because they knew that the blonde was losing his grip on reality. It started ever since he learned to control the flames. But after he managed to shape them to perfect replicas of anyone, things went downhill fast. He ignored anyone that tried to make him stop, got in arguments with people over this, and even managed to break a bond. Said bond was patched back together over the course of time, but at times you could still see the cracks in it. He wasn't happy with what he did. To think that he managed to break his bond with Natsu of all people. For months he didn't even spare a glance towards him, no matter how hard he tried to repair the damage and apologize. When he finally succeeded, he thought that everything would revert back to normal, but fate had other plans for him. While things around him did revert back to normal, he did not follow the flow. He stayed back, lost in his own world, and continued to lose himself from those around him. He slowly became detached from them all until the guild master himself started believing that they had all lost hope in him, and were trying to treat the blonde as a shadow of the past. Not that the blonde minded or even seemed to care, he was already lost in his own world. Makarov did his best talking with the blonde. He managed to pull him out of his world, if only for a bit, and make him realize what he was doing. The blonde understood, or so Makarov liked to believe. It was only later that he realized that the talk he had with the blonde didn't do much, and by then it would be too late. Already, there were only a handful of people that still tried their best and never gave up on the blonde. The majority already saw him as a lost cause, especially after the numerous failed attempts to set him straight. Makarov himself was confronted with a dangerous decision. He knew of someone that could put the blonde with his feet back on the ground, but if word got out of what happened, it would make life too harsh for the blonde in the future. He also didn't want to receive orders to terminate the blonde's contract with the guild. The council didn't understand how things worked, it's what Makarov said, and for that reason he didn't want the word to spread about the blonde. Lisana, Mira Jane and Urza kept trying to help the blonde pull himself together. For Lisana it was due to the fact that she saw him like an older brother. She was younger than him by at least a year, and Naruto had helped her a lot in the past. The blonde always helped those around him, not bothering to ask anything in return and not wanting anything in return. But they felt that this time it was him that needed help, and if the others wouldn't help him, then they alone could. It's impossible. The brat's already lost it. Luxus, no matter how much he hated saying that, he knew that it was impossible to bring the blonde out of his imaginary world. He couldn't really understand what made the blonde so attached to his mother that he would do anything to actually have her next to him. Despite his words, they still tried. The teen felt it was hopeless and useless at the same time. There were moments when he gave it a shot as well, but nothing came out of that. He had been ignored, plain and simple. It was like talking to a brick wall. Your words would just bounce right back at you, not reaching the one on the other side. Mara Jane felt her anger building up inside of her once again. She knew that sooner or later Urza would snap as well. She could see her holding back her frustration from reaching the blonde. When talking to him, she tried to play it nice. She tried to sound nice, like there was nothing wrong in the first place. But slowly, that was crumbling. Mira tried her best to keep her emotions in check. Anger, frustration, sadness, and worry. She was worried for the boy she had been crushing for 3 years. She was sad for the fact that his heart was still in pain over the incident when he was 8. She was frustrated for the fact that he couldn't come to terms with what happened, and she was angered over the fact that he would use his own powers to lock himself in a imaginary world. She was angered by the fact that he just didn't seem to want to understand that there were people here that were worried for him, that wanted him back, to revert to his own normal self. Shaking her head, Mira looked at the blonde sitting at the bar and playing with a crystal amulet. She rarely saw that. It was a memento from his mother. He rarely showed it in public, fearing that someone might steal it. On the days he would actually carry it with him, he wouldn't let anyone hold it, let alone touch it. He was almost paranoid about that item. She was ashamed by herself, but it sickened her to see something like that. In her mind, it brought him pain. She wanted it to be gone so that the blonde wouldn't suffer anymore. But she steeled herself. It would only hurt him further if she took it away and hid it. He would frantically search for it, and become his new addiction, or something else might happen, something worse. She was too afraid to even think of what might happen. Mira turned towards her sister and nodded at her. At least for his birthday, the blonde would return to reality, and then they would try and make him realize he needs to stay there. They would have a talk with him on that day and hopefully get through him. If that wouldn't work, she was afraid what would happen to the blonde. She then turned to the other side of the bar and saw Urza sitting at a table, alone. She seemed to be in deep thought. If Mira had to take a guess, then she was more than sure the redhead was thinking about the gift she planned to buy the blonde. It was common knowledge in the guild that the blonde had been eyeing a very expensive short sword from Armifer. It wasn't your normal short sword. It was designated for fire mages, meant to boost their overall spell power and also give them new spells that could only be created through the use of said sword. Urza had been planning for weeks on buying that sword for the blonde. She hoped that by buying what he wanted, he would stop his addiction to recreate his mother's image and slowly open his heart. Urza had also tried teaching Naruto the art of swordsmanship, just for that reason. It came for the blonde like second nature. He easily learned the basics and advanced steps, and when he reached the expert level, Urza was completely shocked that the blonde would not only master the steps in a month, but he would be able to stand toe-to-toe with her, even if it was for a very short amount of time, in a spar. Mira and Urza put aside their little war for the blonde just to get him to open up and get over his past. They hoped that they would succeed, and then things would actually return to normal in the guild. 3 months were left until his birthday. Even though he had started getting a grip on reality once more, the blonde realized that the damage had already been done. He could hear it in their whispers and he could see it in their eyes. They doubted him and his sanity now. He knew that. He was sure of that. Worst of all, people seemed to be less interested in talking to him now. He couldn't place it, but he felt like they had completely lost hope in him. He looked at the ceiling sadly. He had to figure out something, he had to overcome his past. He couldn't afford to live in it anymore, it just showed he was weak and his mother would never be proud of him then. His eyes narrowed as he violently shook his head, he needed to stop thinking about that. As he looked back at the ceiling he felt himself getting tired. In mere seconds he fell asleep only to wake up outside the guild in the middle of the night. He jumped on his feet and looked around frantically. Something was amiss. There was no sound around him. The river that could be usually heard at night made no sound. There were also a few people up at this hour. He could see lights in the windows but no movement or sound. Then he heard something from in front of him, from the guild. The lights were on. He slowly walked towards the guild and peered inside. It was empty. There was no one here. Curiously he walked inside and as he reached the center of the bar the doors slammed shut scaring him. He laughed nervously as he looked around. "This isn't funny guys," he said with a shaken voice as fire burst in front of him. He watched as the fire took a shape he thought he recognized. "Mother?" he asked as he looked at the flare. A sinister chuckle echoed around him. No, a deep voice was the reply as the fire took the shape of a fox, the size of a dog. "Who are you?" he stuttered as the voice started laughing, echoing around him. Yet when he looked at the fox he couldn't see its mouth. It was like it had no mouth to begin with. "Here is a riddle, boy," the voice echoed around him as the blonde looked around, turning with his back at the fox. "Riddle?" he asked, confused and a little angry. "Just tell me your name," he demanded as the voice started laughing once more. "And what have you done with everyone?" The voice laughed for a good 5 minutes before its words echoed around the blonde. "I've existed since the dawn of time. My number is 9. My power alone is feared throughout the world. I am the strongest of the 9 I am." "QB," the blonde whispered as he turned his head slightly towards the fox sitting on the bar. Its face started shimmering before a large, toothy grin appeared. "Not bad," the fox replied as its eyes fixed with the blonde's. "Though I must say I am not that good at rhymes or riddles for that matter," he laughed. Naruto took a step back in shock as he tried to find something to defend himself with. The fox eyed the blonde and his every move with amusement in its eyes. For the blonde it was the most terrifying experience to be standing in front of the demon that had nearly crushed his previous home. "Why are you here?" he inquired, shivering. "Where is everyone? What have you done to them?" he shouted as the fox's grin widened. "Why, we are in your mind, boy. As for what I've done to everyone." The fox seemed to ponder for a second. "Nothing for now," he replied with a sick grin as he jumped off the bar and started walking towards him. "No, stay back!" the blonde shouted, crawling backwards, trying to get as far away as possible from the fox. The grin started fading. His face started shimmering until an angry look appeared. The fox started growling, showing its fangs as its 9 tails appeared behind it, and started shaking violently. "You boy, you've caused me so much trouble!" he shouted as the ground around the blonde started shaking. "Have you no idea how much you damaged your mind?" he shouted as bits of the world around the blonde started crumbling, revealing a strange violet vortex in the cracks. "What are you doing?" shouted the blonde, frightened as the fox continued to growl. "Me?" he asked angrily. "I've been fixing your mistakes. Your errors," he shouted as the blonde tried to move away further from the fox only to hit the large doors with his back. He tried to open them and run away. But as soon as he opened them he nearly fell in the large vortex. With a frightened look he turned back to face the fox. "Fixing organs is one thing," he growled out, moving closer to the blonde, "but fixing one's mind. Do you know how hard that is?" he roared as the blonde nearly fell on his back and into the vortex. "In all my years of imprisonment, I've never had such a weak host. You are a disgrace," he shouted as he lounged towards the blonde only for the blonde to duck and roll under the fox. He saw as the demon fell into the vortex and was sucked by it. Taking a deep breath he leaned on the table behind him. He brought his hand to his chest to calm his heart down. He needed to find a way out of here. "Comfortable?" he heard the fox. With a scared look on his face he turned his head and looked behind him. He found himself leaning against a grinning fox. "Ah!" he shouted in fright as he jumped away and crashed on the ground. He could hear the fox laugh mockingly as he scrambled back on his feet and started running upstairs to his room. "Run as much as you like. But I will find you no matter where you go, weakling." The fox's voice echoed all around him as he ran up the stairs. He thought he could hear it running up the stairs after him, but he was too afraid to look behind and verify. As he reached his room he crashed into the door, opening it, and then slammed it shut. He locked it and placed a chair against the doorknob before jumping in his bed and pulling the covers over his head. He started praying to whatever god was listening to let him wake up from the nightmare. She was never here to begin with. He heard the fox as the sheets were pulled away from him, and he found himself staring at his mother's body, only that the head was that of the fox. "Get it in your mind. She is dead," he shouted as the body dissipated in air and the fox appeared in front of him. "No!" the blonde shouted, moving his hands towards his ears. The fox shot forward, its front paws pinning his hands to the side of his head. He struggled trying to pry himself free, but nothing seemed to work. He looked up at the fox with fear in his eyes. It was then that he noticed the fox seemed to be in pain and electricity moved around its body. "How dare you disgrace the name Uzumaki?" he demanded. "Your mother was stronger. Your great-grandmother was stronger. You on the other hand are weak," he roared as he bit on the blonde's arm, making him scream in pain and the fox howl in pain as well. "Stop it!" The blonde shouted desperately as the fox moved its head towards his face and stared in his eyes. "Wake up, boy, wake up and smell the ashes," he said in a low voice. "Move from the past, live the present, or we both die," he shouted as he opened his mouth and moved his head towards the blonde. "Ah!" Naruto bolted up in his bed, sweating and panting. He brought his hand up to his chest to calm his heart and looked around. He jumped and shouted in fright once more when he saw the fox next to him. "Naruto!" He was slapped by the fox. He blinked and realized it was Gray standing in front of him with a worried look in his eyes. "Naruto! What happened?" he asked as the blonde looked down at his feet, still panting and with a look of sheer terror on his face. "Nothing, it's nothing," he stuttered as Gray frowned. He didn't like that answer. It wasn't an everyday occurrence for the blonde to wake up in the night screaming as if someone was trying to kill him. "Naruto, it's not okay, what happened?" he asked as the blonde tried to find an answer. He couldn't tell them that the demon inside of him talked with him. They didn't even know he had a demon sealed inside of him to begin with. If they found out, he didn't know what would happen. He was too afraid to think about that. "A nightmare, just a nightmare," he replied, trying to lean back in bed to fall asleep, yet Gray wouldn't let him. He wasn't satisfied with the answer. "What kind of nightmare?" he asked. "About what?" he asked again, not giving the blonde a chance to answer the first question. It took him a minute to think. He didn't really know what to tell the boy. "A fox, it was a nightmare about a fox," he replied weakly as he started shaking once again. It seemed like Gray bought it as he nodded and stood up. "Try not to think about it," he advised the blonde, who nodded back. Gray then turned around and walked back to his bed, mumbling, "What kind of nightmare is that with a fox in it?" If Naruto hadn't been so frightened about his first encounter with the Kyuubi, he would have laughed at that question and tried to joke. But now he was too afraid to even move from the spot he was in. As he tried to close his eyes and fall asleep, he heard the laughter that would haunt him all night and the demon's voice. "She is dead, get that through your mind or else we die." For the next 3 months the blonde had been acting strange in everyone's opinion. They were glad he no longer had the fire follow him around and that the life returned to his eyes, but this time, the look of sheer terror and confusion in his eyes made them worry even further. Gray told them about the nightmare. Makarov had gone into a panic as he heard it was a nightmare about a fox. They wondered what connection the fox had with the nightmare to make their master so afraid. That day Makarov had spent it with Naruto to clarify things. To say he was shocked of what he had learned was an understanding. He made the blonde promise he would keep quiet about this until they figured out what the fox meant by both of them dying. If there was some sort of impending doom for them, then why didn't Kyuubi just tell them what was going to happen? Makarov just couldn't explain this. He had never met nor talked with the fox to understand it. He only heard stories from Minato and Kushina but never actually met the fox in person. When the others asked him what he learned, he kept quiet, much to their annoyance. The fact that the blonde was avoiding everyone and keeping to himself didn't bode well with anyone in the guild. Ever since that nightmare he never smiled again. All his smiles were forced. Urza and Mira knew this for sure. After all, they had been the closest ones to the blonde ever since he joined Fairy Tail when they were young. Naruto, for his part, was too caught up in his thoughts to see what was happening around him. He was trying to understand what the fox was telling him. Ever since his encounter with the fox, if he tried to summon the fire, nothing would happen. It was like the fox had taken away from him his ability to summon fire and control it. He didn't tell this to anyone. He was afraid what would happen if they found out. He had to find an answer to his problem by himself, and as fast as possible. Yet as the days passed he couldn't find any kind of answer. Trying to get in touch with the fox once again didn't help at all. It was like the demon was ignoring him. At nights he could still hear its voice, saying the same words over and over again. It angered it. It annoyed him that he couldn't understand what the fox was saying. It didn't help that his encounter with the fox had turned into a nightmare, and every night it kept on replaying and replaying. It was like the gods were playing a sick joke on him. It was only a month before his birthday that he finally managed to make contact with the fox again. Yet, he couldn't quite call it a success. The fox had did all the talking. Every time he tried to ask a question or utter a word, no sounds came from him, and the fox didn't even seem to acknowledge the fact that he was trying to speak with it. "Do you wish for your powers to return?" it asked him. He tried to question it, to find out why it took his powers away, but nothing came out of his mouth. It tried to make gestures, but it was like the fox was oblivious to them. "I will return them, you will need them however. You're still not ready," it told him. He couldn't understand what it was trying to say. He felt warm. He felt himself entangled by the flames, yet the flames didn't burn him. They were his. His power had been returned to him. "Your mind is still in turmoil that I cannot accept. Fix it, or I will fix it," the fox growled out. Somehow the blonde realized that he wouldn't want the fox to fix whatever was broken about him. The thought that the demon would take bits of his mind and replace them with something else didn't bode well with him. He tried to nod, to let it know that he would do as it requested, but the fox was gone before he could do so. He woke up that night sweating and panting again, yet this time he had not woken up half the guild. For the coming weeks he thought of ways to fix whatever was broken. He tried to figure out what was wrong with him that needed to be fixed. He never realized that he was ignoring those around him until it was too late. It had been 3 months, or maybe even more, since he last spoke to anyone, especially Urza. When they met on the hallways of their dorms they bumped into each other. The blonde dusted himself and muttered an apology before walking away like nothing happened. The girl stopped him in his tracks, calling his name, The tone in her voice made the blonde freeze and lose track of whatever he was thinking. Then looking into her eyes and seeing the look of disappointment and anger pained him more than 1,000 swords stabbing him through the heart. It started like a somewhat normal conversation, yet in the end they ended up yelling at each other. In their mind they were the ones right over the argument, and the other one was wrong. It was later that the blonde realized Urza had been right all along. He needed to pull himself together. He needed to realize that there were people waiting for him in the real world, people that needed him. Yet on that day, he was too absorbed in his thoughts that he couldn't stand listening to anyone and ended up hurting one of the girls that had always cared for him. It pained him when he saw her leave with tears in her eyes, or at least one eye. He knew then that everything was gone. Everything that he had worked with on his relationship with Urza was broken in half and gone. He was still too young to drown his sorrows in alcohol, so he did the next best thing. He spent most of the days at the bar, far away from everyone, rarely talking to anyone. Urza never came down from her room, or if she did Naruto never saw it. He had been there most of the time, rarely leaving. Naruto? He heard Mira call for him. Tomorrow was his birthday, yet he didn't feel happy about that. He felt sad, he felt angry, not at those around him, but at himself. And most importantly, he felt like a complete jackass. Yet he answered while looking at the memento from his mother. He started twirling around his fingers and playing with it, to keep his mind distracted from any bad thoughts that might pass his mind. Maybe you should check on her, I'm worried, she said as the blonde stopped playing with the amulet for a second before resuming his act. I can't, he replied weakly, making the girl frown and lean towards him over the bar. Naruto, you're her friend as well. Sure, you had an argument, but who doesn't? She asked as the blonde lowered his head. She said she doesn't want to see me ever again, he replied as Mary Jane shook her head slightly. She knew that already. She had heard Urza shout that to the blonde before storming to her room and slamming the door shut. She didn't mean it, trust me, he said, but it fell to deaf ears as the blonde started staring intently at the amulet in his hands, muttering several words. With a sigh, Mira moved away from the blonde and resumed her work. She hoped that by the time she was done the blonde would be able to actually talk normally with her and get over it. She didn't have that luck. By the time it was night and the bar closed, nothing changed. The blonde was still in the same spot, with bangs under his eyes and still staring at the amulet like he was in some sort of trance. Naruto, Mira started as she waited for him to acknowledge her. Come on, you can't stay like that forever, she said, but there was still no reply. She sighed heavily as she started thinking what to do. Leave me alone, he finally replied as she looked towards him. Mother will help me, he whispered in a pained voice as Mira's eyes widened. She felt like something snapped inside of her. She lowered her head and tightened her fists. It was always about his mother. It was always about that. She didn't want him to obsess about her anymore. She didn't want him to suffer about her anymore. She glared at the amulet. If that amulet was hidden, then maybe the blonde would actually be brought back with his feet on the ground. With a quick move, she snatched the memento from his hands and moved back. The blonde's head snapped up as he looked at Mira Jane with surprise and shock in his eyes. He then glared towards her and extended his hand. Give it back, he growled as the girl glared at him darkly. Why? She asked in a pained voice. So that you can go back in your own world? She shouted, gaining everyone's attention. That does not concern you, he shouted back as he tried to snatch the amulet from her hands. Give it back, he demanded as the girl dodged the boy's efforts. No, Naruto, she retorted, flinging her hands around. She was furious. This is only bringing you pain and pushing you away from us. I can't stand it anymore, she shouted as the blonde tried to jump over the counter and grab it. You don't know anything about my pain. Give it back, he demanded as the girl slapped him on the face, making him pull back in shock. Don't know anything? She asked as tears threatened to spill out of her eyes. Do you have any idea how much it hurts us to see you like that? She questioned as the blonde started trembling and clenching his fists. Do you think it makes us happy to see you suffer like that? She questioned. It's the only thing I have left from mother, he shouted, looking at her. It was like he never heard her words to begin with. Give it back. He launched towards her, surprising Mary Jane. She threw her hands behind her and slipped on the ground. Her fists opened and the amulet flew from her hands, hitting the wall, then the ground, and shattering in the process. Every activity stopped at that. The blonde looked at the scene with wide eyes, fear and confusion etched in his blue orbs. Mira held back her gasp as she looked at the remains of the once beautiful amulet. She looked at the petrified blonde and stood up. Naruto, she started only to step on a piece of the shattered amulet. A crunch was heard and the blonde flinched. She stopped moving as the blonde lowered his head and turned around. Wait! She shouted, Naruto. The blonde stopped for a second and mumbled a few words. He shook his head and continued walking. Leave me alone, he whispered just enough for her to hear. The pain in his voice froze her in place. She let her anger get the best of her, and in the process she had destroyed the only memento the blonde had. She bit her lower lip as she felt like crying. How was she going to fix this? The next day everyone was gathered in the bar. The blonde had left in the morning, probably going into town. They didn't check. After what happened last night, they wanted to give him some space. Even Gray left him alone that night, and spent the night someplace else. Mary Jane was still overcoming her shock. She planned to make up to the blonde today, on his birthday. She made sure all preparations were in check and that everything was in order. The girl looked towards the stairs and saw Urza there with a solemn look. In her hands was her gift for the blonde, all wrapped up. She shook her head and walked back upstairs. Mira smiled slightly. She knew that Urza would come back in a few minutes to either help out or present her gift to the blonde. She looked around admiring the decorations and the feast prepared for the blonde. She looked back at her sister as she brought out the cake and set it on the table in the middle. Moments later Urza walked down the stairs and blended in the crowd. She kept the gift in her hands. Most likely she would hand it to the blonde personally. As the clock turned 8 p.m. they turned towards the door, waiting patiently for the blonde to return. Makarov was also missing, so most likely he was bringing the blonde back. Just then the doors opened. They all smiled waiting to see the blonde, yet it was only Makarov that walked inside, closing the doors behind him. He looked at their confused faces and then at the decorations and the cake. The candles were lit. Blow those candles off and take the decorations away, he stated glumly as he started walking to the second floor. Everyone looked confused at that. Even Luxus moved towards the edge of the railing and looked down in confusion. But master, it's Naruto's birthday today, Lisana said with a low voice, not understanding why they had to pack up everything after they worked so hard on it. Makarov stopped walking and looked down at the ground, replying, Naruto's gone. He told them, shocking everyone. He left this morning. I don't think he will return anytime soon, he told them. A resonating clang was heard as they all turned towards Urza. Her eyes were wide in shock and horror. Her gift for the blonde was laying on the ground. She was trembling as she brought her hands to her face and turned around, dashing up the stairs. Mira didn't handle it any better as she collapsed on her knees. It's my fault, she whispered to herself as she lowered her head and started sobbing. I'm sorry, she repeated before she jumped on her feet and started running towards the door. Mira! Shouted Makarov as he moved to grab her. Nei-chan! Lisana called out, running after her with Natsu, Gray and Elfman. The girl collapsed on the ground just a few feet away from the guild. I'm sorry! She shouted while sobbing, please don't leave. But it was too late. Alright, the blonde was far away from the guild by now, far away from the place he spent half of his childhood. Makarov looked at the girl sadly. He then looked towards the horizon. Naruto, please return soon. On the train bound for Bosco, a blonde boy looked at the moon with sadness in his eyes. I'm sorry, but I have to do this, he thought as he looked down at the ground, letting a few tears drip from his eyes. Happy birthday, Ignis Deus. Chapter 4. The blonde groaned as the horse-led carriage bumped into the holes on the road. He had been in Bosco for a year already, doing various jobs for various people. He made sure not to let them know he was a fairy tale member, just in case the jobs he took were against the law imposed by the Magic Council. To those that he was 100% sure that they were honest jobs, he let the people know he was a member of Fairy Tale, but kept his name a secret. Since he had no nickname, the people had no idea what to call him. He dismissed all the names that they kept giving them. If he wanted a nickname, he would choose it. Besides, who would want a strange nickname like Firebender? Who in their right minds would name themselves like that? Naruto sighed as he tried to think of something else. He looked in the distance. He could vaguely see the volcano Maestek. His destination was the town of Lajimas, located right at the base of said volcano. A mage in the bar of Bosco's capital told him there was something amiss there. The villagers wanted a strong mage to kill a demon residing in the volcano. So far all the mages that had tried said mission vanished in the depths of the imposing volcano. Some said they were eaten alive by the demon, others said they fell to their deaths in the molten lava. It was after all an active volcano. So Sunny, the man taking him to the town, started, an old man in his late 70s if the blonde was correct. What business do you have in Little Lajimas? He asked as the blonde leaned in the carriage and looked at the sky, analyzing the clouds. There's a job to take out some sort of demon, pays well, need the money and it sounds interesting. He replied as the man started humming. Honestly, I'd rather avoid such a mission if that was me at least. He told the blonde, who chuckled slightly. I'm more of an adventurous type. He told the man with a small laugh. Said man grumbled something about suicidal mages, making the blonde chuckle even further. Maybe he was suicidal, maybe he wasn't. It was just one of the reasons he was out here, away from home. To get in touch with reality once again, and to put his past behind him. And what better way of doing that than to help others in their time of need and get good money out of it as well. Over the 1 year since he left, he had slowly adjusted to the lifestyle he forced himself in. He couldn't complain. It could have been worse, but he did better than he would have expected. He was starting to forget about his past. He slowly started opening his eyes and seeing the world for what it was, for the bad and for the good. He fondly thought back of his mother, but this time he didn't delve in the past like before. There were moments when he thought about writing letters to send back home, to let everyone know he was alright, to apologize to them, but he needed to complete his journey before he could actually do that. He wanted to return home as a new person, as a reformed man. He wanted to make them proud and not have them worry for him anymore. Mira was right, Urza was right, he couldn't let them down, not now, not ever. We will reach Lajimas in an hour, the man said as the blonde smiled and nodded, letting the old man know he had heard him. He listened to the world around him and fell asleep with a content smile on his face. He could rest up a bit before the trials ahead. Sunny, the blonde, slowly opened his eyes and took a deep breath, stretching. We're here, the old man said as the blonde looked around. They were in the market district of the town. The old man was setting up shop to barter his goods. There were very few stores in Lajimas and most goods came from farmers that traded them for the right price. Thank you, mister, the blonde said with a bow as he handed him a small pouch with 1,000 jewels. The man looked at the bag amazed. He never expected the mage to pay him. He had picked up the mage on the road to the town, doing a right deed and helping him reach the town faster. If the boy was to walk to town, it would have taken him a day at best. The man wanted to ask the blonde why he paid so much, but the blonde had already vanished in the crowd. A small smile appeared on the old man's face as he silently thanked the generous mage and continued his work. Said mage was currently making his way to the center of the town. After asking a group of townspeople where the town hall was, they directed him to the center, telling him it was a large building behind a park with a fountain in the middle of said park. As the blonde walked through the streets, he could see several townspeople were on the edge. He heard whispers among them how another mage vanished in the depths of the volcano. Now the blonde was even more interested in the volcano, and whatever demon was hiding in there. He only hoped he wouldn't have to go down too much to reach his target. Going in a volcano was suicidal, even if he was a fire mage and had certain immunity to fire. This was lava. The heat from it was more intense. It would tire him faster than anything else. As he reached the park, he looked for the town hall. He spotted the large building across the park. It didn't look like much, but that was to be expected. This was a small town with a population barely above 10,000. Naruto slowly made his way through the park, smiling as he passed several children that were playing there. Reaching the large door, he bowed towards the guard and let him know he wanted to talk to the mayor. The guard nodded and opened the door, telling the blonde to walk up the stairs to the last floor. Naruto did as he was told. He had to admit, he was impressed by the decorations in the building. Paintings adorned the walls. The walls were painted in a brilliant mix of red and brown, and the ceiling had a deep blue color. Everything looked expensive here. He wondered how they built this structure and decorated like this. It must have taken them years to complete this. Upon reaching the last floor, he looked around for the door to the mayor's office. He was surprised the last floor had only one door, meaning that it was dedicated to the mayor's office alone. He walked towards the door and knocked several times. He heard a deep voice telling him to step inside and did as he was told. Upon entering the office and closing the door behind him, Naruto bowed towards the mayor and looked around the room. The walls and ceiling were painted in the exact same color like everywhere else in the building, paintings on the walls and carpets on the floor. He was surprised the carpets weren't that exquisite like the rest of the decorations. Everything bought for the mayor's hall is done from my money, or the generous donations of the people, the mayor said, as if reading the blonde's mind. He looked up towards the mayor, who was sitting behind his desk and studying the blonde, a man in his mid-30s with a shaved beard, green eyes and brown hair. He was dressed in the typical clothing for mayors, which consisted of a black suit with a red bandana going down from his right shoulder towards his left hip. Other than that, the man seemed like a humble person, unlike other mayors who had different accessories, were it cigars or jewels. This man had none at all. May I ask what business you have in Lajimas, or why you have come to see me? He inquired as the blonde nodded. I've come following the word of a demon located in Maestek. He noticed the man's eyes widen at that. I've heard rumors of how mages died trying to slay the beast, and that you were still looking for a mage capable of bringing it down. The mayor sighed sadly as he heard that. He stood up and turned towards the window looking at the volcano. A shiver ran down his spine as he gazed towards it. He then turned towards the blonde with a sad look in his eyes as he shook his head. I thank you for coming all this way, but I'm afraid I will have to decline your help, he said as the blonde tilted his head to the side curiously. Tell me, why is it that you wish to go down there and try to defeat the monster? He asked as the blonde immediately answered. I wish to help your people. I wish to become stronger, and I need money, he replied without stopping to think or take a breath. The man smiled a little at the first part of his answer and then shook his head. He walked back to his seat and sat down looking towards the blonde. I thank you for that, however I'd feel bad sending someone so young down there. The blonde frowned at that. This was the first time someone doubted him because of his age, or was too afraid to send him on a mission. Even so, sir, I assure you my skills are top of the notch, despite my age. The man nodded with a smile. I never underestimated your skills. It's just, he paused there looking towards the ground. So many mages lost their lives there already, twice your age. They surely had more experience than you. Now the blonde understood where this was going and frowned deeper. I understand, but would you rather wait for another mage to arrive? I've heard mages talking that they are starting to stay clear of this mission. It won't be long until no one will dare try and come here, he told the man, hoping to get through to him and get this job. The man seemed to ponder over that. He could see he was having a battle inside his mind over what to do. I assure you, even if I die, I'd die for a just cause, the blonde said as the man lowered his head further. Maybe it wasn't the right thing to say, he cursed his mouth. He really needed to think up a speech of sorts before meeting his clients, else he would fuck it up and lose the jobs. They stood in silence for minutes. The only sounds they could hear were the laughter of the children in the park and the large clocks ticking. Naruto never moved his gaze from the man, who seemed to be in deep thought. Finally, the man looked up at the blonde with a frown. Very well, if you really feel that you can do this, he said with a weak voice. Naruto realized that he didn't want to have his death on his conscience. After all, he was still a child. To send a child to his death was too much for the majority of clients. There were those that didn't care, of course. They just wanted the job done, didn't care how it was done or who died. Naruto bowed deeply, showing his respect towards the man. Rest assured, I will put an end to whatever is terrorizing your town, he said as he turned around and walked out of the office, leaving the man to his own thoughts and worries. When the blonde reached the first floor, he walked over to one of the employees of the city hall and asked her for a map towards the volcano, and if she knew of an entrance. The woman looked like she had seen a ghost when the blonde asked that. Her face was deathly pale. She asked him if the mayor actually let him do the job, and he acknowledged. She was doubtful of that. However, she went on and explained the blonde how he could enter the volcano. There was no entrance at the base of it. He would have to climb up to the top on a path that was made long ago by whoever lived here before. The blonde asked her about the path. Apparently there was another civilization that lived here long ago. It's believed they sacrificed people in the volcano to their god. Or at least that is what the archaeologists said after spending a few years here digging for tombs or remains of the ancient civilization. The young mage wondered about that. He wondered if maybe the demon was a product of said sacrifices, or if the ones performing the sacrifices were mages of a dark guild. Yet the woman told him that the demon had always been there. He only started acting up 6 years ago. It was like it had slumbered until then. Bidding the woman farewell, the blonde took the map she gave him and made his way towards the volcano. Before he even left the town, a lot of people had gathered at the exit, apparently waiting for him to wish him luck. Word seemed to travel fast here. He was amazed at how many came to wish him luck. He gave them a reassuring smile and continued his journey towards the tip of the volcano. Shit, the blonde swore as he looked at the large chunk of rock fall the lava down below. That was not a good idea, he whispered to himself, as he moved slowly along the wall with his back. He tried his best not to look down. The intense heat coming from down below was enough to make him lose focus, to tire him and lose balance. He didn't need to get a fear of heights now. He looked up, taking a deep breath. It was night. By the time he had reached the tip of the volcano, the sun had set. Going down into the volcano proved to be tougher said than done. He had nearly fallen from the ledges at least 10 times in a row. His heart was beating at abnormal rate, and he felt dizzy. But he couldn't stop now. He told them he would succeed and promised he would always succeed in everything he did. He pressed on forward. Naruto looked around and saw a large platform. Taking a deep breath, he jumped towards it, landing in the middle. He took a deep breath and grinned. His grin vanished, however, as he heard a crack. His eyes widened as he saw the platform cracking and falling apart. He jumped back on his feet and ran towards the wall. He jumped in the last second as the platform fell from under his feet towards the pool of lava. He crashed in the wall, grabbing whatever he could. The blonde tried to pull himself up. He moved his right hand up and grabbed another rock. He moved his left hand and grabbed another. The blonde looked down at his feet and started hitting the wall until he managed to secure his feet in a small hole. Naruto looked around. There was no other platform. He looked down, wondering how far he needed to descend until he reached the so-called down, or whatever was down there. He hoped that the volcano hadn't been the one acting up for those past 6 years, cause if it was, it would mean everything had been a false alarm and the volcano was just on the brink of erupting. That, however, didn't bode well with the blonde. His eyes widened as he felt his right hand slipping. He moved to grab another rock, however that one broke as soon as he grabbed it. With wide eye, his body moved backwards and he started his descent towards the center of the volcano. Naruto frantically looked around for something to grab. It didn't matter how sharp it was. He just needed something to halt his descent. His eyes rested on a rather sharp rock towards which he was falling. He grimaced as he turned his body around and moved his hands towards it. The blonde grit his teeth in pain as his descent came to an abrupt halt. With one hand he was holding on to the ledge and the other was dangling around his body. He narrowed his eyes, looking for some place to jump. A small cavern grabbed his attention, not far from him. He looked up and moved his free hand up, grabbing the ledge. Turning towards the cavern, he started moving forward and backwards to gain speed. Finally, he let go of the ledge and flung himself towards the cavern, crashing in it. He sighed as he felt the ground under his feet. His relief, however, was short-lived as the ground started shaking and the floor underneath him shattered. Once more he started his descent, however, this time it was towards the darkness. With a loud thud, his body made contact with ground. Everything was blurry and dark. There was only a peck of light coming from his right. With a groan, the blonde pushed himself up and nearly fell back on the ground. He grabbed his arm and started walking towards the light. His eyes widened as he found himself stepping back into the volcano. Only that this time it seemed like he was at the very bottom. The strangest thing, however, was the fact that he wasn't suffocating from the heat. It was actually bearable, like he was at the tip of the volcano and not the very bottom. He saw a large, round platform in the middle of it and a path leading towards it. Slowly making his way towards it, he noticed several bones littered around him, even a burned corpse that was missing its lower part. It seemed like whoever that was fell in the lava and tried to pull himself out of it. Naruto grimaced at the sight. He stopped in the middle of the platform and looked around. There was no sight of the demon, or anything like that. "I must congratulate you," a voice echoed around him as the blonde tensed. He dropped in his combat position and frantically looked around with his eyes. "It's been a long time since one managed to reach my lair," the voice stated once again, "and such a young human too," it said, clearly amazed by Naruto's feat. Fire suddenly burst in the air from the lava, in front of the blonde. It slowly took shape, making the blonde's eyes widen in fear and awe. A fire elemental, he thought as he gazed upon the imposing being. Its face had no distinctive shape. It was oval. It had no mouth or nose, only a pair of golden eyes that shone brightly like the sun itself. Its body was bulky with chunks of rocks composing it as fire poured out of it. Its arms bulky as well, a large bracelet of some sort on each arm. The elemental had no legs, a fiery vortex was present under it, large at the top and thinned down as it reached the ground. At its very base fire blazed around it. It seemed like the elemental hovered in the air. The being looked at the blonde, yet Naruto could not read what expression it had. "I commend you for passing the first test," it said as the blonde looked at it curiously. "First test?" he asked, not understanding. The area started shaking, as if the being chuckled at the blonde's question, yet no such sound came from it or echoed around him. "Yes, you see, I've been waiting here for a worthy mage to make a pact with him or her. I wish to have a worthy mage to become my summoner," the being stated, making the blonde's eyes widen at its proclamation. The book he had bought years ago said that finding a fire elemental that actually wanted to have a summoner was as rare as the dragons themselves. "Then all these people?" he asked, looking at the corpses littered around him. The being, however, shook its head. "No, they all fell to their deaths. None managed to reach me like you did," it stated, making the blonde understand what had happened to all the mages that tried reaching the center of volcano. "They all fell and died, either by hitting this platform or by falling in the lava itself. How come I'm not suffocating to death?" he asked as the creature stood still, yet the blonde was sure it was smirking. "I've cast a spell reducing the heat around this area so that my future summoner could take the second and final test," the being said as the blonde nodded in understanding. He wondered if he should take the test. It was rare for a mage to have an elemental as his summon, extremely rare. It would give him a lot of boost in his powers, and who knows what else it could do to benefit him for the future. "What test do you have? And is it only one?" he asked, looking at the being. "The first test required you to reach me to show your courage in facing one of Mother Nature's forces itself," the being started as the blonde listened to it carefully. "The second test requires you to defeat me in combat," it then stated, making his eyes widen at the proclamation. "What?" he nearly shouted. Panic was evident in his voice. "There is no way I could defeat you," he said, taking a step back. "While it is true the odds are stacked against you, you have no choice." "The test began as soon as you stepped onto this platform," the being said, making the blonde gulp. "There are a few things you need to know. Slowly the heat will shatter my magical barrier. In how much time I do not know. That complicated things for the blonde more than he wished. Second, lava will slowly rise the moment we start fighting until it will consume this platform and devour you whole." Now Naruto was more than sure there was no way he could defeat this thing. "And finally, should you lose, the volcano will erupt, killing those in the town below," the elemental said as the blonde tensed and narrowed his eyes. "You wouldn't," he threatened with a low growl as the being stood silent for a couple of minutes. "These are the rules set in place long ago. They shall not change," it stated as the blonde bit his lower lip to hold back a growl. "What if I do not wish to fight you? What if I just turn my back now and start going back up?" he asked as the elemental immediately replied. "Then you lose," it stated as Naruto grumbled. "How much? How much what? How much until the lava eats up the platform?" the blonde asked with narrowed eyes as the being stood silent for a few seconds. "That you will have to figure it out," the elemental stated as it moved its arm towards the blonde, fire shooting out of it. Naruto instantly reacted. He jumped out of the way, rolling on the platform and avoiding the attack. He then jumped back on his feet and moved his body to the side as the same attack from before nearly hit him head on. He turned towards the elemental and glared as he moved his right hand in front of his face, covering his mouth and showing only his eyes. A pillar of fire shot from underneath the platform and in front of the blonde. It started surrounding him, creating a protective shield around him. The attack from before turned around and moved towards the blonde, hitting his defense. It was immediately sucked by the blonde's fire and assimilated. The elemental seemed to be surprised by that. "A fire mage, interesting," it stated as it raised its arms in the air and lowered them on top of the blonde. Said blonde jumped backwards, avoiding the attack. His fire created a wall in front of him, protecting him from the bits of lava that shot towards him. It then dispersed, continuing to circle around him. He jumped backwards on top of another platform, higher from the one he began on. The fire around the blonde shot in all directions, each moving to another platform. It took the form of human archers. The elemental looked at each one as they all took their fiery bows in their hands and pulled the strings. An arrow appeared on the bows, and as they released the string, the arrows shot towards the elemental, hitting it. The attacks were mostly ineffective, but their force was enough to make the elemental move its body back a little from the force. It turned towards the blonde and saw him with a large fireball in his hand. He moved his arm backwards and then threw the fireball towards the elemental, hitting it in the chest and making it take a step back. The volcano shook as the elemental roared. Bits of rocks fell from the walls into the lava. 10 pillars of fire shot from the lava and moved towards the blonde and his fire archers. The elemental's attack took down the blonde's fire like it was nothing. His eyes widened as he jumped away from the platform he was standing as one of the fiery pillars crashed into the wall and drilled till it reached the other side. The area started shaking once more as the blonde turned around with wide eyes. He ducked just in time as the same pillar of fire smashed the wall behind him and appeared in front of him. Naruto placed his hand on the floor and jumped away, grabbing a ledge from the wall. He looked around as fast as he could and grinned. Turning back towards his target, he waited for the elemental to make its move. 3 pillars of fire shot towards the blonde, who grinned and jumped out of the way. The pillars smashed into the wall, completely destroying it and dispelling themselves. The elemental moved its right hand towards the blonde as spikes made out of fire shot from its palm towards the blonde. Naruto ran as fast as he could as the spikes crashed in the wall around him. He jumped from platform to platform, dodging the fiery spikes. He came to an abrupt halt, falling on his back as the platform split in two right in front of him and lava burst out. He looked towards the elemental whose left arm was up in the air. This was its doing. He glared at the obstacle in front of him and jumped back on his feet. Running towards the wall to his right, he started running up it until he felt he was slipping. He then used all his force and pushed himself away, twirling in the air and landing on a platform above the elemental. He looked towards the last support beam and summoned a fireball. He threw it towards the support, and jumped away from the platform as it came crashing down on top of the elemental. The blonde landed on a nearby platform and watched as the previous one crashed on the elemental's head, making it sink in the lava. He grinned. He would have to thank the elemental for doing most of his job in destroying the other three support beams with its attacks. The ground started shaking as the blonde nearly lost his balance and fell in the lava below. The elemental rose from the lava, shattering the platform that had fallen on top of it. With a mighty roar, lava and flames sprout out all around it. The being turned its gaze towards the blonde and moved its hands towards him. The lava and fire shot towards the blonde. The majority took the shape of a dragon's head or another ferocious animal. His eyes widened as he jumped out of the way, a quarter of the attack hitting the wall and destroying part of the volcano. On the outside, an explosion was heard as people could see fire spewing out of the base of Maystek. Back inside the volcano, the blonde was having a bad time. Dodging the attacks was one thing, but being careful not to fall in the lava was another. The platforms started cracking every time he stepped on them. He was sure the elemental was at fault for that. At one point he was about to fall in the lava with the platform that started sinking. He noticed that the platforms on top of the lava would start sinking the moment he stepped on them. He also noticed the lava's level rising at an alarming rate. It wasn't long before the platform he had begun on was completely consumed by it. When he started, said platform was at the elemental's chest level. There were about 20 platforms going further down, underneath the one had started on. By now, more than half of those were underneath the lava. It wasn't long until the main one was consumed and he lost the trial. Spinning around, he created a wall of flame trying to stop the attacks. Only one of them was stopped as the others crushed his defense and kept rushing towards him. He summoned a fireball in his hand and threw it towards the incoming fire, making both of them disperse from the impact in a large explosion. The blonde ducked and jumped to the side as several pillars of flame and lava smashed on the platform he was on. He landed on a platform at the elemental's knee level. The platform started shattering as lava burst in the air, lifting chunks of rock. The blonde covered his face and tried to maintain his balance as the piece of platform he was standing on was lifted in the air. He lowered his hands and created two fireballs, on in each hand, and threw them towards the elemental, hitting it in the chest. He jumped out of the way as the elemental moved towards him, swiping its arm at him. The blonde landed on another small chunk of rock being lifted in the air. He looked around and noticed the lava was rising at increased speed, faster than before. Pieces of the platforms were lifted in the air in different locations. He turned towards the elemental and jumped out of the way as its arms smashed into the chunk of rock he was standing. The blonde continued to move backwards, jumping from platform to platform until he reached the wall. Creating two more fireballs, he hurled them towards the elemental. Said elemental smashed one of them with his arms and took the second one in the chest. It roared as it sent a punch towards the blonde, only for him to jump out of the way. The punch hit the wall of the volcano, making it shake. The being took its arm out of the hole and continued chasing after the blonde. Naruto kept jumping from platform to platform while hurling fireballs towards the elemental, drawing it towards him. The elemental kept on sending pillars of flame or lava towards him or throwing its fist at him. Each time they missed, hitting the wall instead. It was hard to hit such a small target after all. The blonde was like a small fly to the elemental. The blonde landed on the starting platform and started choking. The spell had most likely vanished and there was no air anymore, or the little that wasn't enough to keep the blonde up. His vision became blurry as he looked towards the elemental as its fists moved to squash him. Jumping backwards and falling on his back, he managed to avoid the attack. He shakily stood back up on his feet and grit his teeth. The lava was slowly starting to close in on him and devour the platform. He looked up at the fiery being with determination in his eyes as he crossed his arms in front of him. With one swift motion he separated his arms as a massive firewall, shaped like an X, shot towards the elemental. The being submerged under the lava, making the blonde smirk. The attack hit the wall of the volcano, which shook dangerously. As the elemental emerged from under the lava, a large platform collapsed on top of it. The being looked up as the platform was slowly falling through its body. It was then that the elemental noticed the entire place was crumbling down on top of it. It looked towards the blonde, who wore a confident smirk on his face. It also looked like the blonde was about to drop unconscious any minute. With a roar, the being charged forward, slamming its fist in the platform and shattering it. The blonde was flung upwards, his eyes wide in fear as he flew up for a good 300 meters. As he started descending, he looked around for a platform or anything to grab onto, yet he could barely move his body. He was too tired. Looking up, he noticed the tip of the volcano was collapsing and large chunks of rocks were falling down towards him and the elemental. A smile appeared on his face as he closed his eyes. He had no more strength to move his body, yet he knew that he had won. Even if he died, at least he saved those below. Urza Mira, he whispered as his body was inches away from the lava. A large stream of smoke and hot air shot out of the tip of the volcano as the tip started crumbling, followed by the rest of the imposing volcano's body. Naruto crashed on the ground with a resonating thud. He was lucky he fell through a tree and in the grass. He gasped for air and started coughing. For a second there he thought he had died. He thought he had seen the gates and someone calling for him, yet here he was, gasping for air as the ground shook violently. He rolled around facing the volcano, witnessing as it was slowly crumbling. That was mighty impressive. The elemental's voice resonated around the blonde as the air started shifting in front of him. Fire spewed out of the ground, forming the elemental in all his glory. What, how? The blonde asked. He had expected to die back there. You won, was its answer as the blonde blinked olishly. It was an impressive strategy, to make everything fall on top of me, it said as the blonde grinned weakly. A fight against one like you suicidal. You didn't say how to win, only that I need to win. He told the elemental that started shimmering. It was like it was laughing at the comment. Even so you destroyed my home, it said as the blonde grinned sheepishly. The ground shook as the blonde looked towards the volcano with worry in his eyes. Do not worry, it will not erupt. The lava receded as I wished it. The town is safe, the elemental stated as the blonde nodded with a smile. However, the being started as it started shrinking until it was the same height as the blonde. I would like you to be my summoner, the elemental stated as the blonde remembered why they started fighting in the first place. He grinned as he nodded and extended his hand to shake the elementals, only to realize he would probably lose it. The elemental started shimmering once more. This time he heard it laugh. My name is Inferno. Think of my name, and you shall summon me. Name's Naruto Uzumaki. I look forward to working with you, Great One, the blonde stated, bowing towards the elemental. No need for formalities, from now on we are partners, it stated as it succumbed into the ground, vanishing. Taking a deep breath, the blonde looked at the sky and started laughing. He had done something that the book had doubted impossible. No one had managed to get an elemental summoned for centuries, and yet here he was. After a long battle with one such elemental, he had gained one in his ranks. Slowly, the blonde stood up and started limping towards the town with a smile on his face. When he reached the town, he was immediately assaulted by questions from everyone. They were all worried what had happened as they saw Maystack crumbling. The mayor appeared mere seconds later and dismissed everyone. He wanted to take the blonde to a hospital and have him patched up and let him rest. Yet before the blonde was taken away, he left everyone with a message. I've killed your demon, there is nothing to worry now. With those words, the blonde was taken to the hospital to get his wounds treated. But by morning, his room was empty. Only a note could be found in which Naruto stated he had left to continue his journey. What journey he was talking about they didn't know. The mayor had paid him that night, before leaving the blonde alone to rest. Naruto left in the morning, taking the money and leaving the note. They were saddened that their hero had left, yet happy that he had done what others could not. Tales of his exploit traveled throughout the lands, gaining the attention of everyone. He was the most talked person, from mages to common people. The people of Lajimas had named him Demon Slayer. Ignis Deus. Chapter 5. A figure ran through the forest. His destination was a bandit camp not far from the town that hired him for the job. It was a simple job. All he had to do is kill the bandits and save the ones captured by the bandits. They had taken the daughters of the villagers. Maybe they wanted to sell them into slavery. The blonde didn't really want to think about that. The 15-year-old blonde stopped at the edge of the forest overlooking the bandit camp in utter shock and confusion. In the middle of the camp stood a monstrous creature, as tall as Inferno. It seemed like it was feeding on something, probably the bandits, or so the blonde prayed. Making his way towards the camp, he made sure not to make his presence known to the monster, or whatever it was. As he walked through the camp as stealthy as he could, he felt like he would puke at any moment from the stench in the air. He grit his teeth as his fists clenched. He came across a ritual site and bodies were littered everywhere. The bodies of the women that had been kidnapped. Turning towards the creature, he now realized what it was, a demon. Closing his eyes, he concentrated on his powers. 2 fireballs appeared in his hands as he hurled them towards the demon. He would not let it leave this place alive. As the attack hit the demon in the back, it gave a monstrous howl of pain as it stood up and turned around. The blonde wasn't fazed by its size at all. He didn't care now. After fighting and winning against Inferno 2 years ago, no matter how big a monster was, he would take it down. The demon had 2 large horns on top of its head, a bull-like face with razor-sharp teeth. The body was that of a human. Numerous chains fell from its body as it stood up. Most likely whoever summoned it tried to control it, but failed in doing so. It had hooves instead of legs and 4 claw-like arms. It roared to the sky, making the ground shake, and looked down towards the blonde only to find that he had vanished. Moments later, a spear made out of fire impaled it from the behind. The demon roared in pain as it turned around and trashed around with its arms, flailing them in every direction. Naruto jumped away, avoiding its attacks, and slammed his hands on the ground. A pillar of fire shot from behind the blonde, taking the shape of a large dragon. The blonde's creation let out an imposing roar and shot forward towards the demon, grabbing its shoulders with its front paws. The demon roared in pain as the fire started burning its skin. It punched the dragon in the chest, making a hole that regenerated as soon as it pulled its fist out. The demon used all its force and pushed the dragon off of it. As soon as it was free, however, 2 more fireballs connected with its back, making it stagger forward. Angered, the demon stomped the ground, making it shake and the blonde to lose balance and fall on his back. A massive broadsword then shot out of the ground. The demon grabbed it with one of its hands and raised it in the air. Naruto narrowed his eyes. He jumped out of the way as the broadsword slammed in the ground, leaving a large hole. Turning his gaze towards the demon, he ordered his dragon to attack once more. The dragon shot towards its enemy, slamming its body against the demon's and making it crash on the ground. It then raised its right paw and slammed it in the demon's flesh. It roared in pain as the fire started burning its flesh and insides. The blonde calmly walked forward and stopped in front of the demon's face. Said demon opened its eyes and narrowed them at the blonde. Fire entangled the mage, completely obstructing the demon from seeing his face and body. A massive spear formed out of fire appeared above the demon's head. Before it lowered on its skull and taking its life, the demon muttered two ancient words, Ignis Deus. The blonde looked at the corpse of the demon and dismissed the dragon. The flames evaporated in thin air, like they had never existed in the first place. He looked around the carnage that took place here. He recognized the ritual, albeit a little. He had come across these markings across the world in his travels, in 3 different places at least. One of them was quite ancient and took place not far from a town that had been utterly destroyed by Deliora. Most likely someone had summoned it there in the first place, but the blonde would never know for sure. As he scoured the area, he came across a trapdoor. Opening it, he saw a ladder leading down into the depths. He hoped that whoever was responsible for this was down there so that he could kill them, slow and painfully. 5 mages stood in a circular room channeling energy into an orb when said orb cracked and then shattered to a million pieces. They stopped channeling as one of them walked to the center of the room and inspected the damage. Someone killed it, he muttered as the others looked surprised. But who could have killed it? One asked with surprise evident in his voice as footsteps echoed around them. They immediately tensed and looked around for the origin of the sound. They suddenly heard the sound come to a stop and turned around. In the doorway stood a person wearing a brown leather trench coat unbuttoned up, the inner part being orange. He wore black pants with a gray shirt tucked in by a belt. On his head he wore a black cloth mask, completely covering his face. Only his 2 eyes could be seen. Who the fuck are you? Demanded the leader of the 3 as the man turned towards him and raised his hand up, his palm open and facing him. Your death. He answered as a fire spike shot out of his hand and pierced the unsuspecting man in between his eyes. The man dropped on the ground, face first. Moments later his entire body burst into flames, completely destroying his remains. The other 4 recovered from their shock and immediately attacked the newcomer. The blonde took a few steps back and closed his eyes, vanishing in the shadows just as an ice shard struck the wall where he once stood. They started looking around frantically for the blonde, wondering where he had gone to. A gurgling sound was heard soon, followed by a thud. They turned towards the origin of the sound and found their ice mage lying in a pool of his own blood, with his face on the ground. Yet the man was nowhere in sight. With a panicked scream, one of them started throwing enchanted daggers everywhere. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? One of them demanded as his partner calmed down the third. Don't know, don't care was the reply. It echoed all around them, sending shivers down their spines. Come out and face us like a man, you rat. The second yelled as no reply came. They stood in silence for a couple of seconds until the ground started shaking. They looked around trying to figure out what the blonde was going to do next. All of a sudden light started appearing from all directions. The room had a total of 5 entrances. Light appeared in all 5 hallways. Moments later 5 pillars of fire emerged from the hallways moving towards the mages. One of them, reacting on instinct, raised a wall of mud around them, protecting them from the attack. Yet the pillars never hit the wall. They started moving around the wall of mud as if waiting for them to make a move. They stood there for what seemed like hours. The newcomer was nowhere in sight, and the pillars of flame kept on moving around them, waiting for them to step out. That is until the man's voice echoed around them once more. This bores me was what he said. The pillars of fire suddenly shot up and moved above the mages. Realizing what was going to happen, 2 of them jumped out of the way as the 3 pillars of fire descended upon their colleague, burning him alive. His screams echoed in the chamber, making the remaining 2 move back in fright. The wall of mud collapsed, and the fire shot towards them. They were too afraid to move as the fires created a large head and swallowed them whole, killing them in one go. Slowly, the fires started vanishing. As they did, footsteps echoed around the chamber. The blonde stepped in the middle of the chamber and smelled the air. It smelled like burned flesh. A grin appeared on his face as he snapped his fingers and the entire place was on fire. He calmly walked out of the chamber, letting the place burn away. The people of the small village on the northern coast of Seven looked towards the horizon, waiting for the mage they had hired to return with news or with their daughters. As the sun started rising in the sky, they could see a masked figure walking towards the village. They recognized the figure as being the mage they hired a day ago. Though they wondered why he was alone, they started fearing the worst. As the blonde reached the entrance to the village, he looked at the assembled people and lowered his head. He slowly kneeled down in front of them and started talking. I apologize, I was too late, he told them as he heard several gasps following by crying. He could hear people crying at the news, yet he didn't raise his head to see them. He heard them scream the names of those that had died, or so he thought. He didn't know for sure. Why are you kneeling before us? He heard the village leader asking between sobs. Most likely he had someone that died there. I've failed my mission. This is the first time it happened, and like this, he said, his voice becoming but a whisper. If only I had been faster, I could have stopped them, he said as he continued to listen to the chaos around him. What happened to them? He heard someone ask. He bit his lip, not knowing what to tell them. Should he tell them the truth? Or should he lie to them? He didn't know if they would go there and see the corpse of the demon. Couldn't burn it down. The skin was too hard to burn. It would have taken him at least 2 weeks to fully destroy the body. They were used for a ritual, he said calmly. He tried to find the right words. They summoned a demon by sacrificing them all, he explained. He could hear people gasp, and he thought he heard some faint from the news. What is the demon? One of them started shakily as the blonde answered immediately. I killed it, it will never bother you. He answered, and I brought them back, he stated as he turned around and pointed to a nearby hill. I left them there, covered and arranged. My spells are protecting them from the wildlife. They looked amazed at what he said and grateful at the same time. Why did you do all this for us? One of them asked as the blonde turned back to face them, yet his head still bowed down. It felt like the right thing to do, he answered truthfully as he started hearing people thanking him and leaving. He could hear them walk past him, most likely going to retrieve their loved ones' bodies. As more and more left, he suddenly saw a pouch being dropped in front of him. With wide eyes he looked up at whoever dropped it. It was the leader of the village. He looked at him with a sad smile as he nodded. The blonde, however, shook his head and pushed the bag away. I'm sorry, I can't take them, I haven't completed my mission, he answered while shakily standing up and moving back a little. No, the man started while shaking his head. While it's true you could not complete the mission, you did do more than we could have hoped, he answered as the blonde looked at him curiously. The man, seeing his curious look, smiled and explained other mages would have most likely never brought them here or demanded money for killing the demon. You didn't demand money, and you brought their earthly remains back at least, he answered as he lowered his head. The blonde, however, shook his head again and turned around. You need that more than I do, he told the man as he started walking away. Wait! The old man shouted. The blonde, however, did not stop. At least tell us your name, he called out. The blonde raised his right hand, letting the man see the symbol on his hand. Ignis Deus, he replied as he vanished from the man's sight in a swirl of fire. It was early in the morning when a package arrived at Fairy Tale's doorstep. Makarov was surprised by the large bouquet of flowers that the delivery man gave him. He asked if it was some sort of mistake, yet the man shook his head and told him it was for the entire guild. Curious, Makarov walked inside and set the flowers on the bar. Everyone looked at the man curiously as he walked inside with the flowers, wondered for who they were or from where they came. As Makarov set the flowers on the bar, a letter dropped on the ground. He picked it up and opened it. After reading it, a smile appeared on his face, knowing what it was all about. Mirachan, please put these in a vase, he said as the girl nodded and ran to find a vase. He then walked to the mission board and took a nail out. He placed the letter on the board and nailed it there just as Mira returned with the vase. Good, please put them next to the board, he said with a smile as he turned around and walked out of the bar. As soon as he made his way out of the bar, everyone rushed to the board and started reading the letter. Mira carefully walked through them and placed the vase on a table near the board, then turned her attention to the letter. We're sending this letter and bouquet as a thank you to Fairy Tale for helping us when others would not. Though the mission itself was not completed as the ones needed to be saved were killed before the mage could reach them, he had gone above and beyond to repay his mistake by not only punishing those to blame for our loved one's death, but by killing the monster they had summoned from the blood of our kin. Even after that, he cleaned the bodies and brought them home to us, carried them all the way to our doorstep. When given the reward for the mission, he declined it. No matter how much we tried to persuade him into taking his just reward, he would not. We had never seen such a humble person in our entire life. He bowed before us and apologized for failing the mission. Others would have most likely demanded a reward for killing the beast summoned from our kin's blood. Yet he didn't demand anything. He only asked for forgiveness. This bouquet is a thank you for all those in Fairy Tale, but most importantly, for the one that helped us. A thank you from all those in our little village to Ignis Deus. May he live a long and happy life. Signed, Mayor Omedar. As they finished reading the thank you letter, one thought passed through all their minds. Just who was Ignis Deus? For the first time in his life, Naruto felt scared and unsecure. As he walked through the forest at the border of Fiori and 7, the 16-year-old blonde had this strange feeling that someone or something was watching him. As the wind blew through the trees, he stopped and looked around. He was in a clearing. He carefully looked around, trying to figure out where the one spying on him was, yet he couldn't see or feel anyone around. It unnerved him. Looking around one last time, the blonde took a step forward, then another and another until he felt the presence shift once more. Flames sprouted around him, shooting in the direction he last felt the presence. Nothing happened, no scream was heard. He bit his lip, wondering who was following him. Again he felt the presence, and it vanished just as soon as he felt it. Having enough of these games, he decided to call out whoever was out there. All right, show yourself. I know you're there, he shouted. The only answer he received was the wind blowing through the trees. He grit his teeth as his eyes scanned the area. Then he felt a presence behind him. Spinning around, he came face to face with a strange man. The man was wearing some sort of black armor with a mask with no design on it, only a strange symbol Naruto had never seen in his entire life. At the same time, he could not see the man's eyes through the mask's opening. This unnerved the blonde even further. Who are you? He asked, taking a step back, just to be sure. The man suddenly shimmered and vanished, only to appear behind the blonde holding a strange knife at his throat. The blonde's eyes widened in fear. He didn't even sense the man move, let alone see him. Kyubi, Lord Hokage demands you return to your rightful place as Konoha's weapon, the man stated in an emotionless voice, making the blonde tense and stop breathing. Konoha Hokage, they had found him. They found a way to come to this world and search for him. Still, maybe there was time, maybe he could trick the man into believing he was wrong. Kyubi? Hokage? What are you talking about? I know nothing of these. The blonde shouted in surprise and confusion. You can lie as much as you want, demon. I have been following you for 3 years, I know who you are. He stated as the blonde now knew he was fucked. There was no way out of this, he would have to fight, he would never let himself be dragged back to Konoha. He'd rather kill himself than return to the hellhole that took everything he had dear. Fuck you, the blonde growled as he spun around, the knife barely touching him. He moved to hit the man with his elbow, yet the man vanished before the blonde could even make contact with him. The ninja appeared several feet away from the blonde, standing still like a rock. Summoning his fire, the blonde ordered it to attack, to burn his enemy until there was nothing left but his ash. His target vanished in thin air as the flames collided with the ground. He turned around and looked behind him. There was no one there. He then turned back and came face to face with the ninja who punched him in the face. The blonde was flung back several feet. Before he could even hit the ground, the ninja appeared next to him and grabbed him by the throat. The man spun around and threw the blonde away. He crashed on the ground and rolled for a few feet. As he tried to stand up, the ninja appeared next to him again and slammed his leg into his back, making the blonde gasp for air. He bent down and grabbed him by the hair, flinging him away once more. This time, however, the blonde managed to land on his feet. As the ninja appeared in front of him, he ducked under a kick and moved forward, grabbing the man and slamming him on the ground. He felt a sharp pain move through his body, and he backed away and moved his hand to his shoulder. He felt the handle of the strange dagger, but before he could pull it out, the ninja appeared next to him once more, kicking him in the chest. Thinking fast, the blonde summoned his fire and crashed into it. He used the fire to maintain his ground. Shaking his head, he summoned 3 pillars of fire and ordered them to attack. The pillars shot towards the masked man at great speed. As the first reached him, the man shimmered out of existence and appeared a few feet away. The pillar crashed into the ground, dispelling itself. As the second reached the man, he played the same trick, only this time the blonde was prepared. The pillar rose up before hitting the ground and moved towards the man's new location. Said man lowered his hands and crouched slightly. He flashed through hand signs and a water dragon shot out of the ground. It roared once and moved towards the pillar, extinguishing the fire. It then moved towards the last one, extinguishing that one as well before shattering, dispelling itself. You cannot win, surrender, he ordered in an emotionless voice, making the blonde grit his teeth. He crossed his arms in front of him and concentrated. He then moved them away. A large wall of fire shaped like an X raced towards the ninja, burning everything in its way. The ninja flashed through hand signs once again and slammed his foot on the ground. A large wall made out of solid rock shot out of the ground in front of him. The attack collided with the wall and dispelled itself. The wall was intact. No damage had been done to it. Naruto held back a gasp as his eyes twitched in anger. He shouted to the heavens, bending his body backwards. Fire shot out, formed the ground, consuming him. The fire moved towards the sky and slowly took the form of a massive dragon, which in turn roared towards the heavens, making the ground shake. It lowered its head towards the ninja and opened its mouth. Fire spewed towards the masked man, who jumped out of the way, avoiding the attack. The man proved faster than the dragon, managing to run around it like it was nothing. He then stopped behind the dragon and flashed through hand signs. He touched the ground and a massive swamp appeared underneath the dragon. Naruto jumped out of the way just in time and crashed on the ground a few feet away. He turned to look behind him, and his eyes widened in horror as his strongest attack was sinking in a swamp. The dragon was struggling to set itself free, but to no avail. He looked down at the ground in anger as he dispelled the dragon, the flames retuning to him and moving around his body. Kneeling, the blonde brought his hands up to his face and closed his eyes. The fire intensified and moved around the blonde, creating a small fiery tornado, protecting him from anything coming from the outside. Before he could even begin the summoning, however, the ninja burst through the wall of flame, stabbing him in the hands, binding them together. Naruto shouted in pain as the man grabbed him by the head and kneed him in the face. He then kicked him away, making the blonde unconsciously dispel his fire and landing on the ground a few feet away. I cannot let you bring out that monstrosity, the ninja stated emotionlessly as a pair of claws appeared on his hands. With wide eyes, the blonde struggled to free his hands, yet no matter how hard he pulled, he just couldn't set them free. He looked up towards the ninja and ducked under a swipe. He jumped over his leg sweet and stumbled back as the masked man managed to cut him on the chest. The wound started to burn him, making the blonde grit his teeth in pain. He thought he could see smoke lift from his wound. He ducked under another attack and jumped backwards as the ninja tried to stab him in the chest with his claws. Sidestepping, the blonde raised his leg and kicked the ninja in the chest. Yet instead of being flung back, the man grabbed the blonde's leg and twisted it, making a sickening crack resonated throughout the clearing. He screamed in pain as he tried to crawl away, only to have the ninja grab him by the shoulder and throw him away. The blonde stopped a few feet from his enemy. He slowly got back on his feet and glared at the ninja. He summoned his fire just as the ninja appeared in front of him and moved to strike. The blonde tried to dodge it, yet the attack managed to hit him. His scream echoed in the forest as the ninja slashed him on the face. Naruto dropped on the ground from the intense pain. He brought his hands up to his face and opened his eyes. He screamed once more as he closed his eyes and bit on the dagger's hilt, pulling it out with his teeth. Once more he tried to open his eyes, only to move his hands over them and scream in pain. He started writhing in pain on the ground, trashing all around and cursing the ninja for what he had done. As the ninja moved to pick the blonde up, another person stepped into the clearing. Move away from the boy, the newcomer stated with anger evident in his voice. The ninja turned towards the newcomer and pulled out several knives from his sleeve, yet before he could even throw them he was sucked into the newcomer's attack. His screams echoed in the forest as he dropped dead on the ground several seconds later. The newcomer slowly walked towards the blonde and kneeled beside him. "Who's there?" he shouted. He tried to put up a strong face, yet the fear in his voice was evident. "Don't worry, I'm one of yours, from Fairy Tale," the newcomer stated as the blonde visibly relaxed a little. "Take your hands from your face so I may see the extent of the damage." His voice was surprisingly calm. Slowly, the blonde moved his hands away from his face yet kept his eyes closed. He could feel the man touching his left eye. He gasped in pain at the touch. The man immediately withdrew his hand. "You will need to open your left eye. I know it will hurt, but you have to," the man said. The blonde gulped as he slowly nodded. He slowly started opening his eye, trying to ignore the pain that his brain started registering. He couldn't see anything even though he was sure he had opened his eye. "This isn't good," he heard the man say, worry evident in his voice. "Those claws were poisoned. I will have to take the poison out, but I warn you it will hurt." "I can take it," the blonde said, shaking uncontrollably. He could feel tears leaking out of his eyes, yet no sound came from him. This wasn't what he wanted. He never expected something like this to happen to him. Was he too weak? Didn't he train enough all those years? Did defeating several demons and inferno not strengthen him enough? His train of thoughts was stopped as pain shot through his body from the chest. He did his best to keep his cries of pain at bay, yet when the man moved to tend to his eye it was too much. The blonde howled in pain before passing out from the intense pain. His ears picked up the soft sound of rain. His nose picked the smell of something cooking and he could hear the fire crackling. He slowly opened his eyes but everything was dark. He panicked at that, wondering what happened to his sight. "Easy," he heard someone call. He was about to summon his fire when he remembered the voice. It was the man that saved him from the ninja. "Let me help you," the man stated as he felt his hands on his face. Moments later the darkness disappeared and he could see what was around him. Yet there was something odd. He moved his hand up to his face. A piece of clothing was tied to his head, covering his left eye. He moved to remove the clothing only to have the man grab his hand. "Don't, it's gone," he said as the teen's eye widened at the news. He had lost an eye from that battle. Sure, it was better than losing his life or being dragged back to Konoha, but still he had lost something. He looked down at the ground in sadness, not knowing what to say. The man, sensing his discomfort and pain, backed away, giving him room to think over what happened. They stood in silence for a long time. The blonde did not talk even when the food was done, yet he had accepted the man's generous offer and ate what he was given in silence. After hours of staying in complete silence, the blonde decided to talk. "Who are you?" he asked weakly. He could barely feel his strength. "Miss Gun," the man replied. "Been a member of Fairy Tale for a year now," he said, showing the blonde his mark and proving he was indeed a fellow member. Naruto nodded as he lowered his head. "How long was I out?" he asked as his savior answered immediately. "A week." The blonde was shocked at that. His eye widened in horror at the news. He had been unconscious for an entire week. "Why are we here then?" he asked, looking around the cave they were currently residing in. The man looked at the fire as he answered the blonde's question. "You were having a fever during that week." He paused for a second. "I also lost you a few times due to the poison." The blonde bit his lower lip at the news. He felt incredibly weak. And to think he had died for a few seconds because of one encounter. He brought his knees up to his chest and hugged them while looking at the fire. He didn't know what to do anymore. Konoha was here, looking for him. They already proved to him that they were stronger. The next battle might be in their favor. "Relax," Miss stated as he looked towards the blonde. "Everyone has his or her moment of weakness," he stated as if reading the blonde's mind. His head snapped up as he looked at his fellow guild member in shock. The man's face was completely covered by clothing. All he could see were his eyes. "I feel weak," he stated, looking back down at the ground. "It's the poison. It's a powerful one. Never seen one like that before." Clearly the man tried to put you in some sort of comatose state with it. But the mixture was too potent. It would have killed you in a day or two if not treated, Miss replied while tending to the fire. The blonde didn't bother to react to the news in any way. Either way, he would have been dead if Miss hadn't shown up when he did. "Thank you," he said with a low voice as Miss looked up at him. "For saving me," he said as the man smiled. "It was my pleasure, Ignis Deus," he said with a grin as the blonde's head shot up in recognition to the name. "You are quite famous now. Only a handful of people in the guild know who the great Ignis Deus really is." The blonde nodded dumbly at that, and then turned his attention back to the fire. "What will you do after you heal?" his colleague asked as the blonde stood silent for several minutes, thinking of an answer. "I don't know," he replied. "Would you like to travel with me?" Miss asked as the blonde looked up surprised. "Until you get your skills back or your confidence, or if you wish to feel more secure. There is always more security when traveling with another," he stated as the blonde nodded. "That's true." However, he paused for a minute. He stood gazing at the fire. "I'd like to do something before I actually team up with someone," he stated in a low voice as Miss nodded in understanding. "If you need me, just call," he said as he stood up and started walking away. The blonde didn't bother looking towards him, yet he nodded at what his rescuer had said. He stood looking at the fire and thinking about his next move, wondering what he would do now. For 3 days Naruto stayed in the cave, pondering on his new predicament before actually making up his mind and leaving. He would not let this hold him back. He would train to become even stronger and fight back those that tried anything against him. He had grown to detest Konoha even more in those 3 days. He promised to himself that if he ever stumbled across a Konohanin in this world he would immediately kill him, or her. Miss Gun had never returned after he left. The blonde believed he had a mission or something. Even so, he didn't hold it against him if he didn't want to stay anymore. He wondered however how calling his name would make him know that he wants to team up with him, and even more on how the man found him there battling the ninja. Had he been following him for the past days, weeks or months? Or was it just that blind luck? He shook his head. He had no idea. He would have to ask the man when he would meet him again. Currently the blonde was making his way out of Eridas, a large town at the border of Fiori and Bosco, in Fiori territory. He had finished a small job to get some money and traveled towards Tully village. As he reached the end of the town his eye widened at the person approaching him. It was none other than Urza Scarlet. Lowering his head he made sure not to make eye contact with her, and walked past the girl. The girl noticed the man from a distance. He resembled the rumors of how Ignis Deus looked like, yet she couldn't be sure. Still, it didn't matter to her. She wasn't here to look for a mystery, she had a job to complete. As she passed by the man however something caught her eyes, the fairy tale mark on his right hand. She stopped walking and turned towards her. You! She said with authority in her voice, pointing towards the blonde who stopped for a second before slowly starting to walk away. Stop right there! How did you get that mark? She demanded, yet the blonde started walking faster. Her eyes narrowed as she unsheathed her sword and immediately charged towards the man. For her, the lack of response meant he was an imposter, posing as one of the members of Fairy Tail to get his way around with people. As the blonde sensed her approaching he started running away, sparing only one glance back towards her. He gulped as he saw the serious look on her face. He couldn't afford to get caught. He didn't want to explain to her everything from the moment he had left without saying anything to why he looked the way he did. He ran out of town crashing into merchants, and making their carts drop on the ground in an attempt to delay Urza or lose her. Yet she masterfully avoided all of them until she managed to catch up with him on the plains outside of town. She grabbed him by the collar, and threw him back making him roll on the ground several feet. The blonde jumped back on his feet and faced her. He was lucky he decided to wear the mask, else she would have recognized him and either killed him on the spot for what he did when they were 12, or beat him to a pulp and demand answers. His sweat dropped as he realized she was about to do one of those just now despite the fact she didn't know it was him. How dare you pose as a Fairy Tail member, she growled out as she didn't give the blonde any time to reply. She charged forward swinging her sword towards the blonde. Naruto ducked under her swing and moved backward, stepping to the side and avoiding a slash. He ducked again as she tried to cut him in half and then jumped out of the way to avoid her punch. If he were to use his magic it would be over. She still wouldn't stop her attacks, only for a moment due to the shock, then she would renew them. His eyes narrowed as he managed to grab her hand and throw her over his shoulder. She crashed on the ground and the blonde moved on top of her, stepping on her arms. Yield, he demanded, yet she only growled and hit him in the back with her feet. Naruto stumbled forward as the girl rolled out of the way and jumped back on her feet. She turned towards him and attacked once again. Naruto ducked as she swung her sword, cutting the air in front of his face, mere inches away from him. He ducked and grabbed one of her hands. She slammed her head in his face, making the blonde release her and take a step back. His eyes widened as he jumped to the side, avoiding her sword. Yet before he could move out of the way she grabbed his mask and the clothing over his eye and pulled, ripping them both. The blonde shouted in pain as she touched his still healing wounds and grabbed his face. He dropped on his knees with his head down towards the ground. Urza stopped as she saw the blonde hair. With narrowed eyes she pointed her sword towards her opponent. Up! She ordered as the blonde shook for a few seconds and slowly stood up, his hands never leaving his left eye. As he raised his head he looked towards the girl, which gasped in surprise and dropped her sword from the shock. Naruto? She asked shakily as the blonde looked at the ground and nodded. Yeah, he replied as she took a step forward and moved her hands towards his. The blonde pulled away from her as he pushed her hands away with his right hand, his left hand still covering the left side of his face. She narrowed her eyes at that. Why did you do that? She asked as the blonde looked away and shook his head. Her eyes narrowed further at that display. It was then that she remembered something. When she fought the blonde she only saw one of his eyes through the mask's holes, and the other one she saw some sort of blue clothing. The girl looked at the mask and started searching it. She pulled out a blue piece of clothing. It was soaked in blood. With wide eyes she moved towards the blonde and grabbed his hand. Naruto glared at her as he tried to pry himself free from her grasp. Stop it, Urza. Yet she continued trying to pry his hand away from his face. She could vaguely see something that looked like a cut on his face, but she wasn't sure. Urza, he shouted, pushing her away and shocking her. Please stop. His voice was weak, scaring the girl. He looked down at the ground. He couldn't let her see. It would only worry her further. Once more he heard her approaching. He raised his head up, wanting to tell her to stop, yet this time she moved her hands to the side of his head. A piece of clothing was in her hands. She placed it over his eye and tied it from behind before stepping away with a small smile. Naruto looked down at the ground and adjusted the clothing before looking back at her. He lowered his hand. Her eyes widened at what she could see. There were 3 large gashes going down from his forehead, over his eye from what she assumed, and reaching down to the middle of his left cheek. Urza took a step forward and placed her hand on his cheek, over the clothing. The blonde flinched as pain washed through him. He didn't know if she saw that or realized it. Naruto, his voice was soft, and she seemed scared. What happened? She asked as the blonde lowered his head and placed his hand on hers. He stood quiet for several minutes, thinking of what to tell her. He would return to the guild, someday. But maybe it was better to tell her something now and not do what he did back then when he was 12. The past caught up with me, he replied vaguely, making her frown slightly. Were it not for Miss Gunn, I'd be dead most likely, he said as she held back a gasp. Her eyes were wide at the news. They stood in silence for what seemed like hours. She wanted to ask him who attacked him, who scarred him like that, but she knew that he wouldn't tell her. She could see it in his body language and by how long it took to reply to her first question. She let her hand drop as she moved closer and embraced the blonde. I missed you, she murmured, stunning the blonde. Everyone misses you, she said as the blonde looked at her sadly. He moved his arms around her and held her close. They stood like that in silence until the blonde broke it. I'm sorry, he said weakly. I know I shouldn't have left like that, but I had to, else you would have stopped me, he told her, referring to everyone in the guild. They would have done anything to stop him from undertaking this personal quest of his. She didn't reply at that, yet she smiled a bit. They both wanted to stay like this, for a little longer or even forever. However, the blonde knew he couldn't stay like this yet. He had to finish what he started. He gently pulled away from her. Only now did he realize he was taller than her by a head. He smiled as she looked up towards him, her eyes asking him not to leave. Shaking his head, he moved back a little. I'm sorry, I have to finish what I started, he told her as he turned around. Before you go, Urza started as he felt a surge of power coming from her. He turned around and saw her extending a gift towards him. From its long design, he could only guess it was some sort of sword. Happy birthday, she said with a small smile as the blonde looked down at his gift and gently unwrapped it. His eyes widened as he looked at the sword in his hands. It was the sword he had seen when he was 10 years old in Armifer. How could he forget the sword he had always wanted? The hilt was made out of leather with a gem at its bottom. The blade was long, longer than normal short swords, and thick. The end was pointy. He was sure Urza had polished it over the years and sharpened it. There was even a scabbard for it. It was a normal design one. With a smile, he looked towards the girl. Thank you, he said as tears dropped from his eyes, normal tears from his right eye and, much to Urza's shock, blood tears from his left. She immediately moved to his side and wiped them away with a sad look on her face. Please come back, she said as the blonde opened his mouth to speak. If not now, soon, she said weakly as the blonde nodded. I will, I promise, he told her as he bent forward, giving her a kiss on the cheek. Thank you for everything, he whispered as he stood up and started walking away with the sword in his hand. Urza stood rooted in place, looking at his retreating figure. A tear dropped from her eye as the image of him crying blood from his left eye flashed in front of her eyes. Please stay safe, don't die on us, Naruto, she thought, looking towards the blonde that was slowly vanishing in the distance. I love you, she thought with a smile on her face. Ignis Deus, Chapter 6. A year had passed since the incident with the Konoha ninja. Naruto didn't like thinking about it too much. Every time he did think about it, he felt unsecured and that he was always being spied on. He never really understood why his mother didn't want him to attend the Shinobi Academy. Maybe she wanted him to have a normal life, or maybe she was afraid that he would become a weapon like the ninja said he was. Whatever the case was, he didn't ponder on it. He respected her decision. After all, she had never mistreated him and was always there to protect him. But now, he was on his own. He would have to face Konoha on his own if they tried to come after him again. The only thing he had to be careful of is to not let them know who his friends were, and use them as a ticket to get to him. Over the course of that 1 year he had tracked down Miss Gunn. It wasn't easy, and if the blonde was right, he would have never found him if he didn't want to be found. It was like the mage knew that Naruto was looking for him and left trails for him to follow. He teamed up with the mage that had rescued him when he fought the ninja and did several jobs with him. He had yet to return to the guild, however. Even though Miss Gunn told him it would be good for him to just step inside and see how the place was faring, he didn't want to do that. Every time they went to take a job from the board, Naruto would wait outside for Mist, hidden from view. Mist usually took 3 jobs with him when leaving. Being teamed up with the blonde meant they would be able to handle more than one job, being able to meet the deadlines for all of them. It was as they thought. They had completed quite a lot of jobs, gaining a lot of respect and reputation for what they did. While many still didn't know who they were, their faces or real identities as well, there were certain individuals that had started monitoring the blonde. The council had heard many rumors and facts about the blonde mage. At first they dismissed them when they heard he was part of Fairy Tail. The destructive nature of the guild made them think the blonde was just like his comrades. It was only later that they learned the blonde was something different. Collateral damage was rare when the blonde took a mission. If there was such a thing, it was minimal. There were only 2 times when the blonde had actually razed something to the ground, something that he didn't have to. He paid for the repairs with his own money. In their eyes that said something. Questioning the people that the blonde had helped over the years, they learned that the mage was completely different from what they expected. He was humble towards the people, helping with even the smallest problems. not even bothering to ask for a reward if they never mentioned one. While he had no rank, mostly every mage you would ask about him would say he is well deserving of S rank. While his abilities were mostly a mystery as very few people witnessed them, or very few of his targets survived an encounter with him, it was widely known he could manipulate fire at his will. Add to that the fact that he received his nickname from a demon, or so the blonde claimed, it made him even more interesting in the council's eyes. They had tried to get in contact with him on numerous occasions, yet it was easier said than done. The blonde was a master at stealth. He could vanish even on a large field with no forest or trees in sight. Rumors spread that Ignis Deus would only show himself to those that needed help. He didn't wish to talk to people unless it was related to a mission. It made people wonder why. The council went on to investigate this. They called Makarov to question him, yet they found out that even the guild master hardly knew anything about the blonde. While he could give a description of how he looked like before he was 12, it wasn't enough to help the council track down the blonde and invite him for discussions. Makarov was curious what they wanted to talk to with the blonde. He had to admit that even he wanted to talk with the blonde, but that was because he hadn't seen him for years. Yet the council that just heard about him, he hoped they didn't want something drastic, or wanted to accuse him of something. He doubted the last bit, but you could never be too sure with them, especially those two younger members. Naruto knew fully well that the council wanted an audience with him, but he didn't want to present in front of them yet, so he did the best he could in avoiding their messengers, which proved quite easy. Even the mages they sent didn't seem to be able to spot him. He smiled and shook his head. Someday he will let them find him, but for now, he had other matters to attend to. Looking down at the map in his hands, he scratched the bridge of his nose and wondered why he had accepted to do this mission alone in the first place. Apparently Mist had some other job he needed to take care of and wanted the blonde to handle this one alone. It wasn't that the blonde didn't trust his partner's judgment. It was more like he didn't trust the employee, which was a first actually. Naruto was currently in the country of Bellum, at the outskirts of the small city Elven. He could see the massive keep, Sarmi, in the distance. His mission was simple. He had to quell down the people that seemed to be preparing for a riot, or a coup. Usually people didn't go rioting for no reason, so he dug up as much as he could on the local baron. There wasn't much on him. The little information he could dig up was that the baron liked to tax the people a lot, had a very bad taste in decorations and wardrobe, and his laws were pretty confusing at best. Rolling up the map and placing it back in his pocket, the blonde stood up and started walking towards the city. He grumbled under his breath. How was he supposed to quell down more than 1,000 people? That was just too much. After all, he wasn't going to hurt them or anything like that. As he entered the city, he could feel the atmosphere thicken. It put the blonde on alert. He was still wearing the same clothing from before. This time, however, he opted to hide his face under a cowl. Over his scar from the ninja, he had a black eye patch. On his back was the sword Urza had given him in its scabbard. A blue ribbon was tied to the sword's top end of the hilt. He noticed people staring at him as he walked down the street. He even saw some of them hide their weapons as their friends whispered something in their ears. He could hear murmurs as he walked deeper into the city, people saying his nickname to others. Had they already realized who he was? Then again, the sword and clothing was a dead giveaway, the clothes more than the sword he imagined. While making his way to the keep, the blonde spotted a bar for mages. He stopped and looked at the entrance for a bit before walking inside. As he entered the bar, all eyes turned towards him. The vast majority of the mages there immediately tensed like he was going to attack them at any given moment. He walked over to the bartender and sat at one of the chairs. "What can I get you, sir?" the woman asked. She stuttered and seemed to shiver as she looked at him. He raised an eyebrow at that. Was he really frightening? He had made sure to send a message, by doing the right missions, that he will always help people. "A beer," he answered as the woman nodded and turned around, grabbing a random bottle and bending down with it. He heard her open the bottle. As she stood up and handed the blonde the bottle, he took it in his hands and shook it several times. With the corner of his eye he looked at the woman and saw her tense as he did that. He moved the beer at his nose and smelled it before moving it away. The blonde looked at the bottle for what seemed like hours. The atmosphere so was tense you could cut it with a knife. "Sleep drug," the blonde stated in a low voice as he saw the woman try to stifle a surprised gasp. She had been caught. He looked around and saw all the mages preparing to fight, most likely him. Looking at the woman, he moved the bottle out of the way and placed his hands under his chin. "Tell me, why did you try to poison me?" he asked as the woman stood petrified in front of the blonde. His eye narrowed as flame shot behind him, melting the ice spike. "Are you really going to try it?" he asked loud enough for them to hear. A few of the mages took several steps back at that, while others, despite how much they were shivering, stood their ground. "We don't care how strong you are, Ignis Deus," one of them said in a shaky voice. "We won't let you help Baron Dooku," he shouted as the blonde raised an eyebrow. He lifted his head and turned towards them. "Huh?" he asked intelligently as everyone looked at him strangely. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I understand," he told them as they all blinked in surprise. "Didn't you take the job request that the Baron had posted?" one of the mages asked. He was in his mid-30s. "I did take it, what of it?" Naruto asked as they all looked at each other. A man in his 40s stepped forward and looked at the blonde straight in the eye. "Didn't you find it strange why people are rioting? Why he would want a mage to quell the rioters?" he asked, making the blonde bring his hand up to his chin and scratch it. "Yes," he answered slowly. I did think it was strange, but my digging up on him didn't bring out anything more than the fact he loves to tax way beyond the normal rate, he stated as the mages started whispering among each other. It's not only that he heard someone say in a weak voice, he turned around and looked at the bartender who was looking down at the ground in sadness. All of them first came here for the exact same job until they realized what was actually happening, she said as she looked towards the blonde. And what, pray tell me, is actually happening here? He asked leaning forward. The girl flinched a little at him. I'm sorry for before, she said looking towards the bottle. The mage looked at the bottle and grabbed it. He turned it upside down and started pouring the contents on the floor. As the last drop fell on the floor, he looked up at the woman and slammed the empty bottle on the counter, making her flinch. So what is happening here? He asked again as the woman started fidgeting. Maybe it's better if I show you, she replied in a weak voice as Naruto nodded and stood up. He followed the woman outside in the streets. They were heading for the city center if the blonde was right. As they walked, he could feel something strange. There was a dark aura lingering over the city. The closer they got to the center, Naruto noticed that the number of people around them started dwindling. It was like they were avoiding the city center. The moment they entered the town center, Naruto's eyes widened at what he saw. In the middle of the center stood 5 people, hanged. Their faces were burned and their clothes covered in blood. It's what happens to those that disobey the law, the woman murmured silently as Naruto scratched his chin. The man is a fool, he stated, making her look at him with surprise. The royal army would have noticed this by now. He bribed them, she interrupted the blonde, making him look at her strangely. That's impossible. They know better than to accept bribes, the blonde said, glaring towards her and making the young woman flinch. They did, a voice interrupted them as they both turned around facing one of the mages from the bar. But that's not all. Those that tried to go against his will were killed. Most of us suspect he's working with the Dark Guild, the man said as the blonde turned around and looked at the bodies. He raised an eyebrow as he walked forward towards the bodies and moved his hand over one of them, on the chest. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a mark there. So they've been spying on us the whole time, he thought as he looked towards the keep. Are there any guards that aren't dead or didn't side with him? The blonde asked as he turned around and walked away from the charred corpses. No, at least not that I know of, the mage replied. Did you send out word to the council, or call for help? He asked, looking towards the mage and then towards the woman. Both nodded and looked down at the ground. All our messages were intercepted. Those that tried to leave couldn't, the mage replied. They enacted some sort of barrier. You can enter, but you can't leave, he said as Naruto frowned. This was one risky plan that the Baron was playing. People would eventually notice something was amiss with the city, and the more people that would vanish here, the more attention it would bring to it. He wondered what they were actually after. The Baron, in his opinion, was a small-time player in all of this. Considering there were mages from a dark guild here, it meant that they were the ones that Naruto would have to focus on more than anything else. Looking back towards the corpses, he wondered how many mages the Baron had hired. Alright, I see why you all dropped the job, Naruto stated. And I can see why people would want to riot. It would be the first time he would go against his client. This had never happened before. He knew it was a bad idea to take this job, but now it was too late to think over it. As he turned to leave, the mage called out for him. Wait, where are you going? Naruto looked towards him for a second before continuing his walk. I will get to the bottom of this, he stated. There were questions that the Baron had to answer, and he would have to find out what those mages were doing in this city. He had yet to meet a dark guild that wasn't up to no good. Word traveled through town. The great mage Ignis Deus was on his way to the Baron's keep to question him, and maybe even end his tyranny. Yet people were still uncertain of the outcome. While they had heard what the blonde was capable of, they still had their doubts he could win against the Baron and the dark mages. The mages trapped in the town sent out word to those ready to stand up for themselves, rallying them to start a coup against the Baron and take him down from his seat of power. There were a total of 10 mages, 11 with the blonde. Even if the Baron had a few royal guards under his control, they would be able to win against him. Word spread around the city. Many grabbed all the weapons they could find. The 2 local blacksmiths provided the people with all the weapons and armor they had before the Baron shut them down and denied them the resources to produce any more. The little they had was enough to equip 50 men. Under the cover of darkness, they cut down several trees and produced old-fashioned bows for those that could use them. The number of archers far exceeded the number of melee fighters. By the break of dawn, the people were more than prepared to go against their enemy and put an end to their suffering. Led by the 10 mages, they moved through the streets with torches in their hands. During that night, Naruto had been trying to get inside the keep by any means possible. He was lucky the keep had no moat, but the booby traps set around the wall posed enough danger for him. It took him several hours to find a way inside the keep. He knew that going directly to the door was a bad idea. He had been spotted in the city center through that strange spell. The blonde managed to climb the walls in the end. It was hard enough with the night patrol. While he could have easily taken them down, he didn't want to alert the enemy of his presence. Once he was over the walls, he studied the keep. The courtyard had enough open space for a small army to move around freely. The main building where the Baron was at had the main entrance guarded by a mage. It was hard to see him. The mage wasn't standing guard in front of the door. He was smart. He had hidden himself behind a woodpile. In this darkness, a normal person wouldn't have been able to spot him there. Looking around, the blonde noticed there are no other entrances into the main building. He scowled at that. Maybe the hidden entrance or exit was somewhere outside. beyond the gates and maybe even beyond the city itself. With no other choice, Naruto moved silently on the walls intent on finding a way to climb the main building and enter through one of the windows. It wasn't that hard. Whoever had built this keep made a small error. The main building was connected to the wall at one point, making it easy for the blonde to start climbing up. All he had to do is knock out a few guards stationed there. After several hours of climbing, the blonde managed to enter the main building. Using the shadows, he scouted the entire place, searching for the Baron and the remaining mages. He eventually found them in one of the large rooms, probably the dining room. The Baron was at the table stuffing his face away with various foods while 3 mages were present on the other end of the table. The tallest seemed to be the leader. He was wearing a long robe and his face was covered, making it impossible for the blonde to recognize him. The one to his left was wearing a simple shirt and baggy jeans. 3 massive chains covered his chest, and he had a pair of sunglasses on his eyes. The last one, to the right, was wearing a cowl over his face, a jacket, underneath which he wore a black shirt with a skull design on it. The blonde could see several pouches tied to his legs and hidden under the jacket. He wondered what he was carrying in there. Stepping closer, the blonde listened in on the conversation. "So you're telling me that my job was now picked up by Ignis Deus?" the Baron asked with a mouthful of meat. "Yes, we told you not to send out so many papers. 10 mages would have been enough," the leader stated in a low voice as the man seemed to ignore the comment. "The artifact would make us rich and powerful. The more mages and human lives we have to fuel it, the better," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table and spraying wine on the leader's robe. The leader took out a napkin and cleaned his robe. "I suggest you keep your voice down, don't forget who we are," he stated as the man suppressed a shudder and moved back in his chair. "I hope you'll deal with Ignis Deus," the Baron demanded with a growl. "He's as good as dead," the leader replied as he turned to face the blonde. His eyes widened as the other 2 members suddenly vanished. Without a second thought, the blonde darted out of his hiding spot and started running through the corridors. He spared a glance behind him, and his eyes narrowed as he saw 2 large man-eating plants chasing after him. Creating 2 fireballs in his hands, he turned around and threw them towards the plants. Just as they were about to hit them, 2 massive shields phased into existence in front of the plants, absorbing the fire. As they phased out of the existence, the plants shot forward towards Naruto. The blonde jumped in a nearby chamber and slammed the door shut. He then moved to the window and jumped out. In the middle of his fall, his entire body was entangled by flames. The fire then shot towards the village before vanishing in the night with the blonde mage. "I wonder what your next step will be, mage," the leader stated as he watched the blonde vanish over the city. As morning drew, the keep guards could hear people approaching the gates. Their eyes widened as they saw that all the townspeople had taken up arms and were now at their gates, demanding that they be let inside to deal with the Baron. Of course, when the guards didn't comply with their demands, the mages stepped forward. 2 of them, being able to use earth magic, smashed the gates open, letting the angered mob storm the place. At that moment, the guards armed themselves and ran towards the entrance to meet with the oncoming force. While they were outnumbered greatly, they were better trained and had better armor and weapons. As the battle raged outside, in the keep's courtyard, the Baron glared at the riders. Turning towards the 4 mages, he nodded at them as the leader nodded back and sent out his lackeys to deal with the enemy. "It's time," he stated as he walked away, heading towards the dungeon, a cruel smirk on his face. Outside, the guards were falling one by one, rendered unconscious by the riders. The mages made sure to assist the people in any way they could by immobilizing the enemy. When the blonde arrived at the scene, he was surprised at how well they had handled things. "Looks like we didn't need your help after all," one of the mages stated as he spotted the blonde entering through the crushed gates. "Don't be so sure yet," he said as the doors of the main building were flung open and 3 mages stepped out. The attackers took a step back in shock, recognizing them, mages of the Dark Alliance. Well, what do we have here? Some peasants thinking they can free themselves? And some lowly mages thinking they can make a difference. They taunted as large numbers of soldiers suddenly walked out of the main building. They were all wearing plate armor. They didn't know the Baron had these many guards under his command after bribing them. "Husks," Naruto said as the mages looked towards him. "One of the mages is controlling the armors from inside." He then looked around and spotted the one with the chains, him to be more precise. Said mage smirked, not even fazed by the blonde's declaration. "Oh, it seems like I was found," he stated as the one next to him slapped his forehead. "I told you not to wear those chains, they're a dead giveaway." "It doesn't matter to me," the blonde said, taking a step forward. "You all die here. I'd like to see you try, boy," the mage yelled as 3 armors rushed towards the blonde. Before he could even counter them, however, 3 riders jumped in front of the blonde and parried the attacks. "We can handle these guys, you take down the mages," one of them shouted as the rest shouted in agreement. The blonde grinned as he looked at the mages. "Can you deal with these 3? He asked. "I need to deal with their leader," he stated as they nodded and assumed battle stances. Naruto rushed towards the 3 mages, jumping over the armors. As he reached them, he dodged their attempts to catch him and rushed past them. They turned to follow the blonde only to have the other 10 mages surround. They glared at their opponents before charging them. As he entered the keep, Naruto sensed a lot of energy coming from the basement. He rushed through the corridors looking for the entrance that lead towards the basement. Upon finding it, he slammed the door open and started his descent. At the end of the stairs he met another door. He kicked it open and was blinded by the large amount of light in the chamber. Cracking his eye open, he tried to figure out what was going on. He could see the dark mage in the middle of the room. In front of him was a strange scepter. It was floating in the air and glowing. "You're too late!" the mage shouted as light shot in the air, going through the ceiling. He then recognized the scepter. It was one of the artifacts from the battle against Seraph. If he remembered right, the scepter absorbed the souls of any living being, strengthening the wielder. If the soul was that of a mage, it gave the wielder the mage's ability. Naruto scowled as he summoned his fire. He created a fireball and flung it towards the mage. Before it could even get close enough to him, it dissipated before completely vanishing. The mage smirked as Naruto cursed, a nullifying spell. He unsheathed his sword and charged forward. If his enemy was going to nullify all his magical attacks, then he would have to confront him face to face. The man smirked as a beam of light shot down from the ceiling and covered him. Massive spikes of ice shot from the ground. Naruto's eyes widened as he jumped backwards, avoiding the spikes. 1 down, 9 to go, he said with a sinister smirk as Naruto's eyes widened in horror. "You won't get the rest," he roared as he charged forward again. The mage turned to face the blonde with a grin. "The ritual is already ongoing, it doesn't need me anymore to do what it has to," he said as he has created a lance made out of ice. He flung it towards the blonde, who raised his sword. The lance collided with the sword. The blonde was pushed back by the throw's strength. The lance, however, shattered as it collided with the sword. He lowered his sword and jumped to the side, avoiding several ice spikes. He watched as they hit the wall behind him. They shattered at the impact but left a massive hole in the wall. Turning towards the mage, he swung his sword in his direction as a wall of flame moved towards his enemy, colliding with another set of spikes. The spikes melted from the fire, which in turn dissipated due to the nullifying spell. Naruto jumped back on his feet and ran towards the mage. He jumped up as the mage froze the ground underneath his feet. He turned in mid-air and touched the ceiling with his feet. Using all his strength, he pushed himself towards the mage, entering the nullifying spell's field. The mage's eyes narrowed as he created a large ice wall in front of him. The blonde collided with the wall, his sword cutting the wall in half. "It seems like even your own spells are nullified here," he stated with a smirk as the mage smirked back. "Think again," he said as he extended his hand towards the blonde and 5 black orbs shot towards him. Naruto's eyes widened as he jumped out of the way and deflected one of the orbs with his sword. It proved to be a bad idea as the orb exploded as it collided with the blonde's sword, throwing him back out of the field. He coughed as he stood back up and glared towards his opponent. His eyes widened as another ray of light shot from the ceiling on top of the mage, who started laughing. He turned towards the blonde with a maniacal grin on his face. The mage slammed his foot on the ground, creating a shockwave that threw the blonde backwards into the wall. He raised his hand up as a massive rock shot from the ground. He punched it, sending it towards the blonde. Naruto's eyes widened as he jumped out of the way. The rock collided with the wall, making the entire place shake from the impact. "I need to get serious, or else he will kill the remaining mages," he thought as he moved his eye patch over his other eye. He stood up with his left eye closed. He took a deep breath and opened his eye. The mage took a step back in shock at what he was seeing. No longer was he staring into Naruto's blue eye. He was staring in a red slitted eye. It reminded him of a demon's eye. As the blonde opened his left eye, fire appeared around him. It looked stronger than before and untamed. Naruto sheathed his sword and moved his hands in front of him, in a cross, and glared at the dark mage. It's time, he thought. It would be the first time using this technique with the demon eye. Summoning ethereal form, the blonde whispered as fire shot all around him and started moving towards him. The dark mage brought his hands up to his face to cover himself from the intense heat radiating from the blonde. A powerful roar echoed in the chamber as he lowered his hands and stood rooted in place. Before him stood some sort of monstrosity made out of fire. It was twice as big as the blonde, barely fitting in the chamber. Its eyes glowed red like the fire its body was composed of. It had no distinct form. The fire constantly moved around, giving different shapes all the time. "You think that will be enough to stop me?" he shouted as he fired an arrow made out of ice. The arrow collided with the flames. Steam surrounded him as the attack melted upon contact. The beast roared once again as it started floating towards the mage. It entered the nullifying spell and the mage grinned. There was no way the blonde would be able to maintain that spell while inside the spell's area. To his horror, however, the spell shattered right before his eyes, the beast unaffected by the barrier he had placed. Fire started moving around the blonde's hand. In a matter of seconds, a large claymore, made out of fire, appeared in his hand. "It's time you die." His voice resonated in the chamber, as the man started throwing numerous ice-based attacks towards the blonde. All of them, however, seemed to fail in stopping the blonde. He kept moving forward. In a last attempt to protect himself, the mage summoned another wall of ice. The blonde raised his claymore, and then slammed it on the ice, cutting it in half and filling the room with steam. The dark mage, unable to see what was going on, never saw the fire blade collide with his head, cutting him in half and burning his body until nothing but ash was left. Naruto then turned his attention towards the scepter, his hand extended towards it, grabbing it and canceling the ritual in the process. If he was right, then the scepter was the one that enacted the barrier around the city, and now it would have fallen. He roared as his body shattered into numerous pillars of fire that shot out of the chamber through the door he had entered. The flames moved through the keep's hallway until reaching the courtyard. There they united and recreated the blonde in his ethereal form. The fighting came to an abrupt halt as they gazed upon the creature in front of them. The fire mage looked around the courtyard. He could see the two mages that had their souls ripped from their bodies. He didn't know how to return the souls from the scepter, however. He continued to look around until he saw two of the three dark mages. One of them was already lying on the ground, unconscious. Fire shot from his body and moved towards him opponents. The two mages immediately used their spells to try and block the attack. One of them, however, died in an instant. Apparently said mage could control the plants around him. Against fire it didn't help him at all. The second one, however, managed to block the attack by summoning a large stone golem. The golem moved towards the blonde and tried to punch him. Its fist moved right through his body, not affecting him at all. The blonde grabbed the golem's arm and slammed it on the ground. The ground shook as the golem shattered and turned into dust. He then turned to face the mage, who seemed unable to move from shock and fear. He extended his hand towards the mage and fire spikes shot from his palm. It impaled the man, killing him instantly. As the mage fell on the ground with smoke coming out of his wounds, Naruto turned to face the townspeople and the mages. The mages moved in front of the people to protect them. He expected this. It was the first time anyone ever saw this form. The Baron is on the last floor. The leader of the Dark Mages is dead. Do what you wish with the unconscious one and the Baron, Naruto stated as his body once again split into numerous pillars of fire, and shot towards the nearby forest. As they reached the forest, they reconstructed his ethereal form. Naruto cancelled the spell, the fire dispersed and started moving around his body as he fell on the ground. He quickly closed his left eye and placed the eye patch over it. The fire was no longer wild, it became tame once more, making it easy for the blonde to dispel it. He shook his head as he took a deep breath. He never expected the fire to be so wild when using his left eye. But the job was done. He looked at the glowing scepter in his hand. Placing it on the ground, he took out a sheet of paper and started scribbling on it. While he didn't know many sealing spells, he knew one that he would be able to use on the scepter until he found someone to completely seal the scepter. As he finished scribbling, he placed the specter on the paper. Seal. Slowly, the scepter's glow vanished and two numbers appeared on it. Both of them were a 9. Satisfied with his work, the blonde stood up and covered his head. He walked into the forest, heading back towards Fiori. What if Naruto is disowned by his parents in Fairy Tail? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoyed this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel. And leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down, and thanks for watching the video, and see you guys in the next video.